My wife mocked my cheap watch during a high-stakes business dinner to impress her wealthy friends. She told the entire table I bought the ugly piece of junk from a pawn shop 30 years ago. I did not say a single word to defend myself. I just let her laugh. But 3 hours later, a billionaire walked up to our table and saw that exact same watch and went completely pale. He asked me where I got it. I simply stated my father's name. The billionaire stood up trembling and whispered that your wife has absolutely no idea who you are. I am Harlan, 69 years old, and somehow still paying the price for protecting my family from the truth. As a man who spent his life building a legacy in the shadows, I allowed my family to live comfortably while I faded into the background. Last Friday, my son Dominic and his wife Allison invited me to a highly exclusive Michelin star restaurant in the heart of the city. It was not a family reunion. They needed a prop. Dominic was trying to secure startup funding from Philip Lancaster, a titan in the venture capital world. Dominic and Allison wanted to present the image of a grounded, stable family to win his trust. Between the plates of overpriced caviar and vintage wine, my own family decided to use me as the punchline to their cruel jokes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to arrogant people who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up meant understanding the value of quiet strength. My father Elias taught me that real power never needs to shout. But inside my current family dynamic, that silence was entirely mistaken for weakness. We sat around a massive mahogany table in a private dining room under a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than most people's homes. The air smelled of white truffles and expensive perfume. Dominic was sweating through his tailored silk shirt, nervously checking his phone every 2 minutes. His tech company was failing fast, bleeding cash every single day, and Philip Lancaster was the absolute only lifeline he had left. Allison sat next to him, radiating cold privilege. She came from old money that had quietly dried up years ago, but she still wore the extreme arrogance of a billionaire. She had invited 3 other wealthy couples to pad the room, creating a fake illusion that Dominic was surrounded by massive success. I sat alone at the far end of the table wearing a well-maintained but much older charcoal suit. It was clean and pressed, but it lacked the flashy designer labels everyone else in the room was proudly sporting. I quietly sipped my sparkling water, hoping to just get through the evening without any major incident. But Allison always thrives on making others feel small just to make herself feel large. She glanced down the long table, her eyes scanning my outfit with pure, unfiltered disgust. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand, and sighed loudly enough to completely stop the surrounding conversations. "You know, Harlan," she said with a vicious, mocking smile, "I really wish you had allowed me to send my personal stylist to your house before this dinner. That suit looks like it survived the Great Depression. We are meeting Philip Lancaster tonight, not attending a neighborhood charity drive. You are making us look like we are begging for spare change." The other guests at the table snickered behind their expensive wine glasses. I looked over at Dominic, fully expecting my son to at least tell his wife to show his father some basic respect. Instead, Dominic just glared at me with pure annoyance. He muttered under his breath, telling me to sit up straight and stop embarrassing them in front of his important friends. I felt a very familiar coldness wash over my chest. I did not react. I simply folded my hands, resting them gently on the table. That was exactly when my wife Cynthia decided to join the firing squad. Cynthia and I have been married for 40 long years, but for the last decade, she has treated me like an inconvenient roommate. She absolutely loves the luxurious lifestyle I provided, but deeply resents my strict refusal to flaunt our wealth. She leaned across the table, pointing her perfectly manicured finger directly at my left wrist. "Do not even bother worrying about his old suit, Allison," Cynthia said, her voice dripping with pure venom. "Just look at the absolute monstrosity he insists on wearing on his wrist. I have been begging him to throw that atrocious piece of junk in the garbage since the 90s. He bought that heavy, ugly thing from a miserable pawn shop downtown for $50. It does not even have a brand name on the dial. I swear he only wears it in public to humiliate me and ruin my social image." The entire table erupted into loud, condescending laughter. One of the guests, a young venture capitalist wearing a flashy gold watch, leaned over and jokingly suggested that maybe I could pawn my watch again to help pay for their appetizers. They all thought it was the absolute funniest thing in the world. They saw a pathetic old man desperately clinging to a worthless piece of junk. I looked down at the watch resting on my wrist. It was exceptionally heavy, crafted from raw, unpolished titanium with a deep ocean blue face. It featured no numbers, no diamonds, and absolutely no brand logo. The only marking on it was a microscopic serial number engraved heavily on the back plate right against my skin. Cynthia was right that it did not come from a fancy luxury boutique, but she was entirely wrong about absolutely everything else. I rested my hand gently on the white linen tablecloth, letting the dim restaurant lighting reflect off the dull, scratched titanium. I did not raise my voice to correct their ignorance. I did not defend my pride. I just looked directly at Allison and then at Cynthia, absorbing their harsh insults with absolute calm. They thought they were the apex predators in this room. They truly believed their leased designer clothes and rented sports cars made them completely untouchable. They had absolutely no idea they were blindly swimming in an ocean that I owned. The cruel laughter finally began to die down just as the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung wide open. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Philip Lancaster walked in. He was a towering, intimidating figure in the financial world, a man whose mere presence commanded absolute terrified silence. He wore a simple dark suit, but he carried the massive weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire on his shoulders. Dominic immediately leaped out of his chair, smoothing his expensive silk tie and plastering a desperate winning smile across his sweating face. Mr. Lancaster, Dominic practically shouted, rushing forward with his hand eagerly outstretched. "We are so incredibly honored that you could join us tonight. Please come take the seat of honor." Philip Lancaster did not even acknowledge Dominic. He completely ignored the outstretched hand, stepping right past my son as if he were nothing but a ghost. Philip stopped dead in his tracks about 3 feet from our table. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking ghostly pale and deeply shaken. His sharp eyes were not focused on Dominic or the wealthy guests or the lavish spread of expensive food. His intense gaze was locked dead onto my left wrist. The restaurant fell into a suffocating, terrifying silence. Philip slowly walked past the confused guests and stood directly beside my chair. The powerful billionaire leaned down, his breathing suddenly very shallow and highly uneven. He pointed a violently trembling finger at my wrist. "Where did you get that timepiece?" he asked. His voice was barely a rough whisper, but in the dead silent room it sounded like a massive thunderclap. I looked up at him, and my expression perfectly composed. "I got it from my father," and I replied evenly. Philip swallowed hard. A single heavy bead of sweat formed on his temple and rolled down his cheek. "And what exactly was your father's name?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure. "Elias Hayes," I said. Philip Lancaster staggered back a full step as if he had been physically struck in the chest. His hands began to tremble so violently he had to grip the back of the nearest heavy wooden chair just to steady himself. He slowly turned his head to look directly at Cynthia, who was staring at him with her mouth hanging wide open in utter confusion. Then Philip looked back down at me. He stood up straight, taking a very deep, ragged breath before he spoke. "Then your wife," he whispered, his voice echoing heavily in the quiet room, "has absolutely no idea who you are." Philip Lancaster did not wait for my wife to process his shocking words. He slowly turned his intense gaze toward Dominic. My son was frozen, his hand still awkwardly suspended in the empty air. The confident, arrogant tech CEO from 2 minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified little boy caught in a massive spotlight. "Mr. Lancaster," Dominic stammered, taking a shaky step forward. "I do not understand. My father is just a retired logistics manager. There must be some kind of massive misunderstanding here. We brought the detailed financial projections for my company. I have the entire pitch deck ready for your review." Lancaster looked at Dominic as if he were a foul insect that had just crawled across his expensive, pristine dinner plate. He buttoned his dark suit jacket with deliberate, slow precision, projecting absolute authority. "There is no misunderstanding, young man," Lancaster said, his voice colder than winter ice. "The only mistake made tonight was my own foolish assumption that I was sitting down with a respectable businessman. I do not partner with people who publicly humiliate their own blood. I do not invest in fools who cannot recognize true power when it is sitting right across from them at their own dinner table." Allison let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. The other wealthy guests at the table had suddenly gone entirely silent, looking down at their laps in extreme discomfort, fearing they might also draw the billionaire's wrath. "Considering this meeting permanently canceled," Lancaster stated flatly. He turned back to me, offering a deep, respectful bow that sent a massive shockwave through the entire room. "Have a good evening, sir." He turned on his heel and walked out of the private dining room without looking back, leaving my son standing in the ruins of his completely shattered future. The silence in the restaurant was absolutely deafening. No one dared to look at me. I calmly finished my sparkling water, placed my white linen napkin on the table, and stood up. I did not need to explain the watch to them. I did not need to tell them that the ugly piece of scratched titanium was actually a founder's token. There are only 3 of those watches in existence globally. They were forged 35 years ago to represent the 3 silent financial pillars that originally funded the entire Lancaster real estate empire. My father Elias was the primary pillar. When he passed away, he left his massive shadow trust entirely to me. I had managed that immense wealth, quietly keeping it completely hidden from my greedy family to protect them from the very corruption I was witnessing tonight. I wanted them to build their own character through hard work. Instead, they built a giant shrine to their own arrogance. The ride back to our house was a suffocating nightmare. We sat in Dominic's leased luxury vehicle. The tension was thick enough to cut with a heavy blade. For the first 10 minutes, no one spoke a single word. Then the initial shock finally wore off and Dominic's terror rapidly mutated into violent, uncontrollable rage. He slammed his hands against the steering wheel, swerving the heavy vehicle aggressively across the empty highway lanes. "This is all your fault," Dominic screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You ruined everything. You completely humiliated me in front of the most important man in the entire city. You and that stupid, worthless piece of junk on your wrist." Allison was crying loudly in the passenger seat, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "We are going to lose the house, Dominic," she wailed miserably. "We are going to lose the cars and the country club membership. How could you let your pathetic father ruin our lives like this?" I sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. I did not raise my voice. I simply stated the cold facts. I did not speak a single word during that dinner, Dominic. You and your wife chose to mock me. Philip Lancaster made his own business decision based entirely on your deplorable behavior. Cynthia whipped her head around from the other side of the back seat, her eyes wide with manic fury. "Shut your mouth, Harlan," she hissed viciously. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You have destroyed your own son's future because of your stubborn, ridiculous pride. I do not know what kind of cheap parlor trick you pulled with that ugly watch or what kind of insane delusion Philip Lancaster is suffering from, but you are going to fix this mess." I remained perfectly silent. My strict refusal to argue only fueled her blinding, toxic anger. When we finally pulled into the driveway of our large suburban home, Cynthia shoved me roughly out of the car. Her face was twisted with absolute contempt. "You are not to leave this house," she commanded, treating me like a disobedient toddler. "You will stay locked in your study until you figure out a way to grovel to Mr. Lancaster and beg him to give Dominic that money. You are completely restricted to this property, Harlan. If I see you trying to leave, I swear I will make the rest of your life a living hell." She stormed inside, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. Dominic and Allison sped off into the dark night, their tires screeching violently against the driveway pavement. I stood alone in the cold night air. They really thought they could still control me. They truly believed I was just a helpless old man they could push around and manipulate to fix their endless mistakes. I walked into the quiet house and went straight up the stairs to my personal study. I closed the heavy wooden doors and locked them securely from the inside. The house eventually grew completely still, but my mind was operating with brutal, calculated precision. I already knew Dominic was drowning in heavy debt. I knew his tech company was just a hollow shell burning through cash it did not have. But I vastly underestimated how desperate and truly dangerous my own family had become. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the faint sound of the front door opening downstairs. Dominic and Allison had returned. I quietly walked over to the vintage brass heating vent in the floor of my study, which connected directly to the main living room below. The unique acoustics in this old house carried every single whisper right up to my ears. I knelt down and listened carefully in the dark. I could hear the sharp clink of ice against crystal glass. Dominic was pouring himself a very heavy drink. Then I heard Allison speak. Her voice was not hysterical or crying anymore. It was cold flat and utterly ruthless. "We cannot wait for the bank to foreclose, Dominic," she whispered sharply. "Your father is clearly losing his mind. He sits around acting like he owns the world while hoarding his retirement money. He is completely disconnected from reality. We need to call that private doctor I found." "What are you talking about?" Dominic asked, his voice slurring slightly from the heavy alcohol. "I am talking about survival," Allison replied in her tone devoid of any human empathy. "We have him evaluated. We pay the doctor to declare him legally incompetent. Once he is diagnosed with severe dementia, your mother will easily get emergency power of attorney. We drain his retirement accounts, we mortgage this house, and we save your company. He gets locked away in a nice, quiet medical facility, and we get our lives back. It is the only way to survive this." I remained perfectly still, listening to my own son pause for a long, terrifying moment. He was weighing my freedom against his massive financial failures. "Do it," he finally whispered. I slowly stood up from the cold floorboards. My heart did not break. It turned entirely to solid ice. They were not just greedy anymore. They were actively plotting to erase my freedom and lock me away in a medical prison just to steal my remaining assets. They wanted a brutal war. Tomorrow morning they were going to get exactly that. I waited in the absolute dark of my study until the digital clock on my desk flashed 4 in the morning. The massive house was completely silent save for the low hum of the central heating system. Cynthia was a very light sleeper, and she had aggressively locked the front and back doors from the inside, taking the main keys to her bedroom. She wanted me trapped like a prisoner in my own home. I walked over to the heavy mahogany wardrobe and dressed in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit. I did not need keys. 30 years ago, I personally installed a thick wrought iron trellis against the brick exterior of the house to support a massive climbing rose bush. I opened the second-story window, feeling the freezing morning air bite at my face. I swung my legs over the sill and gripped the cold iron. At 69 years old, my family assumed I was physically frail. They were entirely wrong. I descended the trellis with quiet, practiced ease, my dress shoes silently hitting the damp grass of the back lawn. I walked 2 miles through the dark suburban streets until I reached a main commercial avenue. I sat in a small 24-hour diner drinking bitter black coffee and watching the sun slowly rise over the city. At exactly 8:55, I crossed the street and stood outside the heavy glass doors of First Sterling Bank. At precisely 9 o'clock, the security guard unlocked the doors. I was the very first person to walk inside. I bypassed the long line of regular morning customers waiting for the standard tellers and walked directly to the heavy frosted glass office of the branch manager. His name was Arthur Gable, a man I had done business with for over 20 years. He looked up from his computer monitor, clearly startled to see me standing in his doorway so early in the morning without a scheduled appointment. He quickly stood up nervously, adjusting his tie and offering me a seat. I did not exchange any pleasantries. I sat down in the leather chair and ordered him to pull a complete and comprehensive audit of all my personal and joint accounts. Arthur began typing, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. As he brought up the main dashboard on his screen, I watched all the color completely drain from his face. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the glowing monitor and my face. He slowly printed out a thick stack of transaction records and slid them across the polished desk. I looked down at the top page. The joint retirement account I held with Cynthia, an account that contained a liquid safety net of exactly $150,000, showed a current balance of absolute zero. The money was entirely gone. I picked up the detailed transaction log. The funds had been aggressively wired out to an external commercial account exactly 32 days ago. I demanded to see the physical withdrawal authorization forms. Arthur hurried to his filing cabinet, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled a heavy blue folder and placed it in front of me. I opened it and stared at the signature line. There was my name signed in black ink. It was a remarkably good forgery. To an untrained bank clerk, it would easily pass a basic visual inspection. But I immediately spotted the fatal flaw. The loop on the capital letter H was entirely wrong. It was rushed and slightly jagged. It was the exact sloppy handwriting of my son Dominic. I looked up at Arthur, demanding an explanation for how such a massive wire transfer bypassed the bank's strict security protocols. Arthur looked deeply ashamed, wiping sweat from his forehead. He explained that Cynthia had come into the bank personally with Dominic. She had verified my identity and falsely claimed I was recovering from a severe respiratory illness at home. Because Cynthia was a joint account holder with equal legal authority, she provided the secondary security authorization needed to bypass the fraud flags. Dominic handled the physical paperwork while my wife provided the perfect, convincing cover story. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the cold reality washing over me. Cynthia did not just turn a blind eye to Dominic's financial failures. She actively participated in robbing me blind. She helped my son commit felony wire fraud and grand larceny to plug the holes in his sinking tech company. They had stolen my life savings to buy themselves a few more weeks of fake luxury. I neatly stacked the forged documents and placed them into my leather briefcase. Arthur looked terrified, asking if I wanted him to freeze the empty accounts or call the federal authorities. I told him to do absolutely nothing and to keep this conversation strictly confidential. I walked out of the bank and stepped into the bright morning sunlight. The bustling city noise surrounded me, but my mind was operating with terrifying silent clarity. If I called the police right now, Dominic and Cynthia would simply be arrested. They would hire expensive defense lawyers, cry in front of a sympathetic judge, and drag my name through a massive public spectacle. They would play the victims and claim I was a confused old man. I was not going to give them that luxury. I walked into a quiet city park and sat on an empty wooden bench. I pulled out my secure mobile phone and dialed a private unlisted number. It belonged to Mitchell Reed. Mitchell was not just a corporate attorney. He was an absolute apex predator in the legal world, a man who specialized in entirely dismantling fraudulent companies and destroying corrupt executives. He answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert. I calmly explained the forged documents, the stolen $150,000, and the recorded conversation plotting my forced institutionalization. I heard Mitchell let out a low, dark chuckle over the phone. He asked if I wanted him to draft the criminal complaints. I told him criminal complaints were entirely too merciful. I ordered Mitchell to establish a completely untraceable offshore shell corporation by the end of the business day. I wanted it fully capitalized through my hidden shadow trust and armed with the most aggressive predatory lending contracts legally possible. Mitchell agreed without hesitation, his voice vibrating with dangerous anticipation. I hung up the phone and looked up at the towering glass skyscrapers. The trap was officially set, and my family was about to walk right into it. I returned to the house just before noon. The air inside was heavy with the unspoken tension of the previous night. I sat in my study reviewing the preliminary corporate documents Mitchell had already expedited. Suddenly, the front doorbell rang, echoing loudly through the quiet hallways. I heard Cynthia open it downstairs, followed by the overly dramatic sound of loud sobbing. It was my daughter, Valerie. She had not visited this house in over 4 months. She only ever appeared when she needed something or when there was a family crisis she could manipulate for her own financial gain. I walked down the grand staircase and found her collapsed on the living room sofa, crying hysterically while Cynthia awkwardly patted her shoulder. Valerie looked up at me, her makeup perfectly smudged to convey maximum distress. She leaped up and threw her arms around my neck, playing the role of the desperate, loving daughter to absolute perfection. "Daddy?" she wailed, her voice trembling with manufactured panic. "I am so sorry to bother you, but I have absolutely nowhere else to go. My cosmetic company is completely bankrupt. The suppliers are threatening to shut down my production lines by Friday, and the bank refused to give me a bridge loan. I am going to lose everything I have worked so hard for. I just need a guarantor for a private commercial loan. Please, Daddy, you are the only one who can save me." I looked down at her tear-stained face. I knew exactly who she had been talking to, and I knew exactly why she was really here. Valerie had always been the quietest architect of the family misery. While Dominic was loud and arrogant, Valerie operated in the shadows, playing the perpetual victim to extract whatever she wanted. I knew perfectly well that her cosmetic company was failing. It was a hollow vanity project built entirely on aggressively expensive marketing and terrible cheap products. She treated the company accounts like her own personal piggy bank, draining the capital to fund her lavish vacations and designer wardrobe. But I also knew she was in close contact with Dominic. This sudden visit was not a coincidence. They were testing my mental state and trying to lock up my remaining visible credit before they executed their brutal plan to institutionalize me. If I signed a standard guarantor agreement using my personal assets, they would have another heavy iron chain around my neck. I gently pushed Valerie back, creating a physical distance between us. I wiped a fake tear from her cheek, playing the role of the gullible, protective old father. "Do not cry, Valerie," I said. My voice was soft and reassuring. "You know I will always do whatever I can to help my children succeed. If you need a guarantor for this loan, I will provide my signature." Valerie's eyes lit up with predatory excitement. She quickly reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of loan documents prepared by her own shady financiers. "Just sign on the last page, Daddy," she said, eagerly shoving a gold pen into my hand. "It will only take a second, and then my business will be totally saved." Cynthia stood nearby, watching the entire exchange with a smug look of satisfaction. She truly believed they were successfully manipulating a foolish old man. I took the pen, but I did not look at the paper. I slowly shook my head and set the pen down on the glass coffee table. "I cannot sign these specific documents, Valerie," I explained, keeping my tone perfectly even and calm. "I am an older man now, and I need to be very careful with my personal liabilities. There are entirely too many predatory lenders out there who would love to take advantage of an aging father trying to help his daughter. If we are going to do this, we are going to do it the absolute right way. I will act as your guarantor, but my personal attorney, Mitchell Reed, must draft the paperwork to ensure both of us are fully protected from aggressive debt collectors. Valerie frowned, her manufactured tears instantly drying up. Her sweet facade cracked, revealing the impatient, spoiled child beneath. "But Daddy, that will take days," she complained, stamping her foot. "The suppliers are demanding payment right now. Mitchell is a corporate shark. He will overcomplicate everything and drown us in useless red tape. I need this money today or my entire brand is dead." "My terms are absolute, Valerie," I replied, turning my back on her and walking toward the kitchen. "Either Mitchell drafts the guarantor contract to protect my assets, or you can find someone else to save your failing vanity project. The choice is entirely yours. You can leave the house right now, or you can wait for my lawyer." She stood in the living room calculating her options. She needed my signature to trap me, and she needed the cash injection to survive the month. "Fine," she huffed, crossing her arms angrily. "Call Mitchell, but tell him to hurry up." I walked into my quiet study, locked the door, and made the call. I put Mitchell on a secure line and explained exactly what I needed. Mitchell was an absolute master of legal misdirection. I told him to draft a seemingly standard guarantor agreement, but to bury a highly aggressive trap inside it. Mitchell chuckled darkly through the phone receiver. He understood the assignment perfectly. "We are setting a tripwire," Harlan Mitchell explained, his voice sharp and precise. "She is currently burning cash at a completely unsustainable rate. This loan only covers her immediate arrears. The cross-collateralization clause will be tied to any fiscal delinquency. When she trips the wire, I will execute the hostile takeover without requiring a single court hearing. It is an airtight corporate forfeiture." Mitchell drafted the 50-page document, layering it with thick, impenetrable corporate legal jargon. But hidden deep within Section 4, Subsection 9 was the lethal clause. It was tied directly to the offshore shell corporation we had established earlier that morning. The clause explicitly stated that my shadow trust was acting as the true guarantor. If Valerie defaulted on a single payment, missed a single vendor invoice, or engaged in any documented financial mismanagement, the shell corporation would immediately assume 100% ownership of her cosmetic company. It included all her associated intellectual property, her patents, her bank accounts, and her entire warehouse inventory. It was a corporate death trap disguised as a fatherly safety net. Mitchell expedited the documents and sent them to my secure laser printer within 2 hours. The trap was absolutely flawless. I carried the freshly printed 50-page contract back into the living room and placed it heavily on the glass table. Valerie was impatiently pacing back and forth, checking her phone and loudly complaining to Cynthia about the delay. "Here is the agreement," I said, pointing to the signature lines marked with bright yellow sticky notes. "Mitchell has ensured that the bank gets their required guarantee, and I am fully insulated from any predatory collection practices. You should really read through the terms before you sign anything, Valerie. Business is business." Valerie let out a loud, exasperated sigh, rolling her eyes at me. "I do not have time to read a legal novel." "Daddy," she snapped, snatching the gold pen off the table, "I need to wire this money to the manufacturer before the end of the business day or my website goes offline." She flipped straight to the back page, completely ignoring the dense paragraphs of absolute financial ruin hidden in the middle of the stack. She scribbled her signature aggressively on the dotted lines and slammed the pen down. "Thank you, Daddy," she said, grabbing the contract and stuffing it back into her designer bag. She did not hug me this time. She did not even say goodbye. She just turned around and marched right out the front door, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I stood at the large bay window watching her speed away in her expensive luxury SUV. She was absolutely thrilled, thinking she had just secured free money while helping her brother tighten the legal noose around my neck. A cold, grim smile touched my lips as I watched her taillights disappear down the street. She had absolutely no idea she had just legally transferred every single share of her entire company into my hidden shadow trust. All I had to do now was wait for her to miss one single scheduled payment. And knowing Valerie's reckless spending habits and terrible business management, that default was going to happen much sooner than she ever expected. The dominoes were perfectly lined up. The weekend finally arrived, bringing my 69th birthday. I never cared much for large, lavish celebrations. I always preferred quiet dinners, a good book, and genuine conversation. But Cynthia saw my birthday not as a personal milestone to honor, but as a massive theatrical production designed entirely to stroke her own ego and advance her brutal agenda. She hired an expensive elite catering company, transformed our sprawling backyard into a lavish country club setting, and invited over 80 guests. Most of them were her pretentious, wealthy socialite friends and Dominic's desperate business associates. They were people who barely knew my middle name, let alone cared anything about my actual health or happiness. I walked out onto the patio wearing a simple but perfectly tailored dark suit. The afternoon air was thick with the smell of expensive champagne roasted meats and heavy floral arrangements. Cynthia was gliding effortlessly through the large crowd wearing a designer silk dress that easily cost more than my first car. She was laughing loudly, playing the role of the incredibly devoted and loving matriarch to absolute perfection. I knew exactly why she went through all this immense trouble and expense. This was not a birthday party. It was a carefully constructed stage. She needed a massive audience. She needed a large group of credible witnesses to watch me willingly hand over the absolute keys to my kingdom. I accepted polite handshakes and hollow birthday wishes from total strangers, keeping my facial expression pleasant and entirely unreadable. I quickly spotted Dominic and Allison standing by the outdoor marble bar. They were sipping cocktails and watching my every single move with the intense predatory focus of starving vultures circling a dying animal. They truly thought today was the day they would finally secure absolute control over my entire life. About 2 hours into the lavish party, Cynthia clinked her crystal champagne flute with a heavy silver spoon. The sharp ringing sound cut clearly through the loud party chatter, instantly silencing the large crowd. Everyone naturally gathered around the massive tiered birthday cake resting on the center patio table. Cynthia stepped up right beside me, placing a heavy, possessive hand firmly on my shoulder. She smiled warmly at the watching crowd, but her tight grip dug sharply into my collarbone, a silent physical threat. "Thank you all so much for coming to celebrate my wonderful husband today," she began, her voice echoing loudly across the manicured lawn. "Harlan has been the strong, silent rock of this family for 4 long, incredible decades. But as we all know, getting older brings new scary challenges. We have to face the difficult reality that our health and our minds can turn at any given moment." She paused, expertly wiping a completely fake tear from the corner of her eye. The crowd murmured in deep sympathy, completely buying her spectacular theatrical performance. I just stood there perfectly still, letting her spin her toxic web for everyone to see. Suddenly, Dominic stepped out from the crowd holding a thick, premium leather-bound folder. He walked right up to the table and placed it directly next to the birthday cake. "We love you so much, Dad," Dominic said, projecting his voice so every single guest could hear him clearly. "And because we love you, we want to make sure you are always perfectly protected no matter what happens. We want to take the heavy, stressful burden of managing the estate off your tired shoulders so you can just relax." Cynthia opened the heavy leather folder, revealing a thick stack of dense legal documents. It was a fully comprehensive emergency medical proxy and an absolute power of attorney agreement. I glanced down at the visible text. If signed, it would grant Cynthia and Dominic absolute immediate control over my healthcare decisions, my bank accounts, my investment portfolios, my properties, and my entire legal existence. It even included a specific clause granting them the legal authority to commit me to a long-term residential care facility without requiring my ongoing consent. They had deliberately ambushed me in front of 80 prominent people. It was a highly calculated and deeply vicious psychological trap. If I refused to sign it in front of all her wealthy friends, I would look like a paranoid, stubborn, and completely ungrateful old man. I would look exactly like the crazy, combative dementia patient they were already planning to claim I was. Allison stepped forward from the bar, holding up a heavy, gold-plated pen. "Show everyone how much you trust your loving family, Harlan," she said, her voice dripping with sickly sweet poison. "Give yourself the ultimate gift of absolute peace of mind. We will handle absolutely everything for you from now on. You will never have to worry about a single bill or decision ever again." The large crowd watched me with expectant, smiling faces. They thought this was a beautiful, touching moment of a dedicated family coming together to support an aging patriarch. They had absolutely no idea they were witnessing a hostile financial coup designed to strip me of my basic human rights. I looked directly at Cynthia. Her dark eyes were hard and demanding, completely devoid of any real affection. She was silently daring me to humiliate her by refusing. I looked at Dominic, who was practically vibrating with desperate greed. He desperately needed that power of attorney to unfreeze the bank accounts and save his sinking company before the federal auditors came knocking. I reached out, but I gently pushed Allison's flashy gold pen away. I smiled warmly at the crowd and then looked directly into my wife's eyes. "You are absolutely right, Cynthia," I said, projecting my voice with calm, unwavering confidence. "Trust is the absolute foundation of any real family, and I trust you exactly as much as you deserve." I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my own personal fountain pen. It was a heavy vintage silver pen I had used for many years. I uncapped it, leaned over the birthday cake, and signed my full legal name on every single signature line. I carefully initiated every single page exactly where their expensive lawyers had indicated. The crowd immediately erupted into warm, loud applause. Cynthia let out a massive, heavy sigh of relief, her eyes flashing with pure, triumphant greed. Dominic practically snatched the heavy leather folder off the table the absolute second my pen lifted from the final page. He did not even stay for a slice of cake. He rushed straight inside the house and immediately locked the documents inside the massive steel wall safe in the private library. He eagerly spun the heavy combination dial, securing what he firmly believed was the ultimate key to my absolute ruin. I slowly capped my silver pen and slipped it back into my jacket pocket, accepting a piece of cake from a smiling guest. My family spent the rest of the evening celebrating their massive victory, drinking expensive champagne, and completely unaware of the lethal secret resting inside my pocket. They did not know that the rich black ink inside my vintage fountain pen was a highly specialized chemical compound used in advanced corporate security. It was meticulously engineered to react with the oxygen in the air and completely evaporate without leaving a single trace. In exactly 2 hours, that thick stack of powerful legal documents locked inside their heavy steel safe would be nothing more than blank, useless sheets of paper. Monday morning brought a desperate, frantic energy to my son's household. While they firmly believed they had successfully locked my assets inside their steel safe during the birthday party, the brutal reality of their immediate financial ruin was still crashing down around them. The stolen retirement money was already swallowed whole by the massive, overwhelming debts of Dominic's failing tech company. He was pacing his living room wearing a wrinkled dress shirt, screaming into his mobile phone at terrified vendors who were threatening to shut down his servers and file public lawsuits. His usual arrogance was slowly being replaced by absolute blind panic. He needed a massive cash injection, and he needed it before the end of the business week, or his entire fake empire would collapse into dust. Just as he was about to throw his expensive phone against the wall in pure frustration, it rang again. This time it was an unknown private number. Dominic answered it, snapping aggressively, but his tone completely changed within 3 seconds. On the other end of the line was a senior associate representing a highly exclusive private equity firm tightly affiliated with Philip Lancaster. The associate spoke in a smooth, calculated voice, offering what sounded like an absolute miracle sent from above. He told Dominic that Mr. Lancaster had reconsidered the harsh dismissal at the restaurant and was willing to offer a private lifeline outside of traditional banking channels. It was a $5 million commercial loan ready for immediate disbursement pending a quick signature. Dominic practically dropped to his knees in pure relief, completely unaware that I was the one who had instructed Philip to cast that specific golden hook into the water. 2 hours later, Dominic and Allison walked into a sleek, towering glass office building in the center of the financial district. They were escorted into a massive, sterile boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire sprawling city skyline. A sharp, middle-aged man in a tailored gray suit introduced himself as the senior underwriter for the private equity firm. I was sitting 3 miles away in the absolute silence of my quiet study, listening to a crystal-clear live audio feed of the meeting through a secure digital connection Mitchell had established. The underwriter placed a thick, heavy stack of heavily redacted legal documents onto the polished glass table. He explained that because of the highly disrespectful incident at the restaurant, Mr. Lancaster required an absolute ironclad guarantee of Dominic's personal commitment. The $5 million loan would not be issued under standard limited corporate liability protections. It required a complete and total cross-collateralization of every single personal asset Dominic and Allison owned. If Dominic missed a single monthly payment or violated any strict covenant of the financial agreement, the private equity firm would immediately seize his massive suburban house, his luxury vehicles, his personal bank accounts, and all his future corporate equity. It was a financial suicide pact wrapped in thick, dense legal jargon. I listened closely as Allison immediately pushed back. Her voice was shrill and deeply suspicious, echoing loudly through the large, quiet boardroom. She demanded to know why they had to risk their personal family home for a corporate business loan. She arrogantly told the underwriter that her family name alone should be more than enough collateral to secure any reasonable investment. The underwriter remained perfectly calm, unbothered by her loud, hostile tone. He simply reached out and began slowly pulling the thick contract back toward his leather briefcase. He told them the offer was completely non-negotiable and they were entirely free to walk out the door and declare corporate bankruptcy by Friday morning. That single terrifying word completely broke Dominic's fragile ego. He slammed his hand heavily on the table, stopping the underwriter from taking the papers away. Dominic desperately explained to Allison that this was just a high-stakes loyalty test from Philip Lancaster. He firmly believed that if he signed the brutal contract and proved he was willing to put absolutely everything on the line, the powerful billionaire would eventually bring him into his elite inner circle. Dominic spent 10 agonizing minutes pleading with his own wife, promising her that the tech company would double in value within 6 months once they had Lancaster's massive capital behind them. Dominic was blindingly arrogant. He truly believed he was negotiating with a strict venture capitalist firm trying to protect its bottom line. He had absolutely no idea he was actually negotiating with a ghost company completely owned and controlled by his own father. Mitchell had meticulously drafted every single page of that predatory contract, ensuring there were absolutely no legal loopholes for my son to escape through. The agreement included a highly specific morality and fraud clause buried deep in the fine print. It explicitly stated that any past or present financial crimes committed by the borrower, including forgery, embezzlement, or the commingling of personal and business funds, would trigger an immediate default. That default would authorize total asset seizure within 24 hours without requiring a lengthy court battle. Dominic was so utterly desperate for the $5 million that he did not even bother to have his own cheap corporate lawyers review the dense legal text. He just stared at the massive number printed on the front page, completely blinded by his own toxic greed. "Give me the pen," Dominic demanded, his voice shaking with desperate anticipation. He grabbed the heavy black pen from the underwriter and aggressively signed his name on every single dotted signature line, ignoring all the glaring warning signs. Allison hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the documents that now held the actual deed to her beloved luxury house. But the blinding promise of $5 million was entirely too much for her to resist. She grabbed the pen and co-signed the documents, legally binding herself to the massive predatory debt. The underwriter smiled a cold, clinical smile and pressed a button on his sleek laptop. He informed them that the massive funds had just been successfully wired into their primary corporate account. The absolute second they walked out of the glass office building, all of their previous panic vanished completely, replaced by extreme toxic arrogance. Dominic felt like a conquering king who had just secured his ultimate legacy. But Allison was the one who sealed their ultimate doom before the sun even went down. Instead of rushing to pay the angry vendors and save the dying tech company, she immediately transferred $200,000 of the newly deposited business loan directly into her personal checking account. She drove straight to the most expensive luxury shopping district in the city. Within 3 hours, she had purchased a brand new customized sports car, a massive diamond necklace, and tens of thousands of dollars in designer clothes to celebrate their supposed victory. She was gleefully spending money that secretly belonged to me, completely unaware that she had just triggered the aggressive fraud clause in the contract by embezzling restricted corporate funds for personal luxury. The heavy steel trap had just snapped completely shut, locking them inside a financial prison from which there was absolutely no escape. It was Wednesday morning and the sprawling house was exceptionally quiet following the chaotic events of the weekend. Cynthia was moving around the kitchen with a strange, highly nervous energy. I sat at the heavy oak dining table reading the morning Financial Times, keeping a close, watchful eye on her reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. I knew exactly what she was secretly planning. Dominic had locked the vanishing ink documents in the safe, completely unaware that the pages were already totally blank. My family needed another angle to secure total legal control over my life before the bank auditors inevitably discovered the forged retirement withdrawal and sent Dominic to federal prison. Cynthia decided it was finally time to execute her ultimate betrayal. She opened the stainless steel refrigerator and pulled out a crystal pitcher of freshly squeezed orange juice. She poured 2 identical tall glasses, placing them carefully on the granite counter. Then she opened a small high cabinet and retrieved a tiny amber prescription bottle. She quickly crushed 2 large white pills into a fine powder using the back of a heavy silver spoon. She swept the thick powder directly into one of the glasses, stirring it vigorously until the liquid turned slightly cloudy. It was a massive dose of a powerful prescription sedative meant to completely incapacitate a fully grown man. She placed the laced glass on a silver serving tray along with a plate of fresh toast, arranging it all to look like a loving breakfast prepared by a highly devoted wife. She carried the heavy tray into the dining room, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered tightly across her face. "Good morning, Harlan," she said. Her voice was overly cheerful and dripping with fake affection. "I thought we could have a nice quiet breakfast together today, just the two of us. You have been looking so incredibly tired lately. I really think you need to sit back and rest." I looked up from my newspaper, silently observing the glass she placed precisely next to my right hand. I did not immediately reach for it. I knew exactly what was coming next, because I had intercepted an email on her unsecured tablet the night before. A private, highly corrupt psychiatrist named Dr. Webb was scheduled to arrive at our house in exactly 30 minutes. Cynthia had paid him a massive cash retainer to conduct an emergency in-home evaluation. The brutal plan was violently simple. I would drink the heavily laced juice, fall into a deep catatonic stupor, and mumble incoherently. Dr. Webb would witness my artificially induced confusion, declare me suffering from advanced aggressive dementia, and immediately sign the emergency medical proxy form Cynthia had waiting on the counter. They would physically drag me out of my own home and lock me inside a sterile psychiatric ward by noon, stealing everything I owned in the process. I looked down at the orange juice. Cynthia had stirred it aggressively, but she was arrogant and careless. A faint rim of white powdery residue clung to the inside of the crystal glass just above the orange liquid. "You are absolutely right, Cynthia," I said, folding my newspaper neatly and placing it on the table. "I am feeling quite exhausted. A good strong drink is exactly what I need right now to clear my head." She sat down directly across from me, pulling her own untainted glass of juice closer to her plate. She watched me with intense predatory anticipation, eagerly waiting for me to take the first deadly sip. I picked up the heavy glass, bringing it slowly toward my mouth. But right before the cold rim touched my lips, I suddenly stopped and looked frantically past her shoulder toward the large bay window facing the street. "Cynthia, did you leave the front gate wide open?" I asked, injecting a perfect tone of mild, confused alarm into my voice. "I think there is a strange delivery truck parked right on the front lawn, destroying your rose bushes." Her dark eyes widened in sudden blind panic. She was expecting the corrupt doctor to arrive secretly, and she absolutely did not want any unexpected witnesses or delivery drivers ruining her carefully orchestrated crime. She immediately pushed her chair back, scraping the wood against the floor, and practically sprinted into the front hallway to look out the front window. The absolute second she turned her back, I moved with the fluid practice speed of a man 20 years younger. I reached across the table and grabbed her clean glass of juice with my left hand and my poisoned glass with my right. I swapped their positions entirely, placing the heavily laced drink directly in front of her empty chair and the clean drink right next to my breakfast plate. I sat back in my chair, my breathing perfectly calm and steady. By the time Cynthia rushed back into the dining room looking highly annoyed and flustered, my hands were already resting quietly in my lap. "There is absolutely nothing out there, Harlan," she snapped angrily, her sweet, loving facade slipping for a brief, dangerous moment. "You must be seeing things again. See, this is exactly why I am so incredibly worried about your rapidly declining mental state. You are hallucinating delivery trucks that do not even exist." I smiled, offering a gentle, highly apologetic nod. "My mistake," I said calmly, picking up the clean glass. The bright morning glare reflecting off the street must have tricked my tired old eyes. I raised the glass and took a long, steady drink, finishing half the juice in one swallow. Cynthia watched my throat move, a massive wave of dark, profound satisfaction washing over her greedy face. She truly believed she had just successfully delivered the final lethal blow to my freedom. She smiled a genuine wicked smile, sat back down in her chair, picked up her own glass, and confidently took a massive gulp of the poisoned juice. We sat together in the dining room in absolute silence. Cynthia kept checking the expensive gold watch on her wrist, silently counting down the minutes until my supposed collapse. She expected my eyes to roll back and my head to hit the table at any second. But as the heavy grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away, the strong chemical sedative began working exactly as intended, just on the completely wrong target. 10 minutes passed. Cynthia's rigid posture began to visibly slump forward. She blinked rapidly, shaking her head as if trying to clear a sudden dense fog. 15 minutes passed. Her eyelids started to flutter heavily, and her speech became incredibly slow and heavily slurred when she tried to ask me why I was not feeling sleepy yet. She gripped the edge of the heavy oak table, her fingers slipping weakly against the polished wood. She was aggressively trying to fight the overwhelming chemical darkness rapidly invading her brain, but the massive dose she had prepared was entirely too strong. Harlan mumbled her words, running together into an incoherent mess. I feel very strange. The entire room is spinning around me. I stood up from my chair, entirely unaffected by my clean drink, and walked slowly around the table. I stood directly over her, looking down into her terrified, deeply confused eyes as her own body completely betrayed her. She tried to raise her hand to push me away, but her arm fell uselessly back into her lap. You should really rest, Cynthia, I whispered coldly, looking at the woman who had just tried to erase my entire existence. You have been working so incredibly hard to destroy my life and steal my money. Take a well-deserved nap. At exactly 20 minutes, her eyes rolled back into her head and she collapsed heavily onto the living room sofa, completely and totally unresponsive. Her breathing was slow and incredibly shallow. I checked her pulse to ensure she was not in actual lethal danger. Her heart was beating steadily. She was simply trapped in a deep, artificially induced coma brought on by her own wicked trap. I looked down at her sleeping form, feeling absolutely no pity or remorse. Right at that exact moment, the front doorbell rang sharply, echoing loudly through the silent house. I looked at the heavy wooden door. It was the corrupt psychiatrist expecting to find a helpless, drugged old man ready to be hauled away. I adjusted my tailored suit jacket, smoothed my tie, and walked calmly toward the door. The predator was about to walk directly into his own absolute nightmare. I opened the heavy wooden front door. Standing on my porch was a tall, thin man carrying a worn black leather medical bag. He wore a slightly wrinkled gray suit and possessed a highly arrogant, sleazy smirk. This was Dr. Webb, the corrupt private psychiatrist Cynthia had hired to destroy my life. He expected me to be a completely incoherent, drooling mess, desperately clinging to the doorframe. He expected an incredibly easy, massive payday for simply signing a single piece of fraudulent paper. Instead, he found me standing tall, perfectly balanced, and dressed in a tailored dark navy suit. I looked him directly in the eyes with absolute sharp clarity. "You must be Dr. Webb," I said, my voice projecting total authority and calm. "Please come inside. My wife has been eagerly expecting you." The sleazy smirk immediately vanished from his face, replaced by a look of deep, profound confusion. He hesitated for a second, glancing down at the address on his phone, before stepping cautiously into the grand foyer. He looked around the quiet house, clearly expecting to hear the chaotic sounds of a medical emergency. I closed the front door behind him, locking the deadbolt with a loud, sharp click. I gestured toward the main living room. He walked forward and abruptly stopped dead in his tracks. Cynthia was still lying completely motionless on the expensive luxury sofa, breathing in a heavy rhythmic pattern. She looked exactly like a lifeless mannequin. But what truly shocked Dr. Webb was the scene set up by the large bay window. Sitting at a small, polished mahogany table was Mitchell Reed, my ruthless corporate attorney. Between two leather armchairs rested a beautifully crafted wooden chessboard. The pieces were already in the middle of a highly strategic midgame. Mitchell was casually swirling a glass of sparkling water, looking completely relaxed. "What is going on here?" Dr. Webb asked, his voice trembling slightly as he clutched his black medical bag tighter. "Where is the patient? I was called here for an emergency cognitive evaluation regarding a severe dementia episode." I walked over to the mahogany table and sat down in the empty leather armchair right across from Mitchell. I calmly advanced my white knight across the checkered board. "I am the patient, Dr. Webb," I replied without looking up from the game. "And as you can clearly see, my cognitive faculties are operating at absolute peak efficiency. Please take a seat." Webb started sweating profusely. He looked at the unconscious woman on the sofa and then back at me. "I think there has been a massive misunderstanding," he stammered, taking a step backward toward the hallway. "Your wife called my private practice claiming you were a danger to yourself and required immediate institutionalization. If she is the one having a medical emergency, I should call an ambulance." Mitchell set his glass down on the table with a heavy thud. "You will not be calling anyone, Dr. Webb." Mitchell stated, his tone as cold and sharp as a razor blade. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Mitchell Reed, senior legal counsel to the man you just attempted to fraudulently diagnose. I strongly suggest you sit down and listen very carefully to what is about to happen to your miserable career." Dr. Webb swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He slowly walked over and sat rigidly on the edge of a nearby chair. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with red wax. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table right in front of him. "Open it," I commanded. Webb reached out with heavily shaking hands and broke the wax seal. He pulled out a highly detailed 20-page medical dossier. It was a completely flawless, comprehensive psychiatric and cognitive evaluation. I had spent 4 hours in a secure medical facility yesterday morning undergoing every single rigorous mental acuity test known to modern medicine. Webb flipped to the final page and his face turned the color of wet ash. "Do you recognize the signature at the bottom of that official evaluation?" I asked, leaning back in my armchair. Webb could barely speak. His jaw moved, but no sound came out. He recognized it perfectly. It was the personal signature and official medical stamp of Dr. Eris Thorne, the absolute leading chief neurologist sitting on the state medical licensing board. It was a completely bulletproof document proving my absolute total sanity and exceptional mental sharpness. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, locking his predatory gaze onto the terrified, corrupt doctor. "We know exactly what you are doing here," Mitchell said softly. "We know Cynthia paid you a $50,000 cash retainer last night. We know you agreed to write a completely fabricated medical report declaring my client legally incompetent so his family could seize his massive estate. You thought you were dealing with a helpless old man whose brain was rotting away. You thought you could just sign a piece of paper and walk away significantly richer. I was just conducting a preliminary wellness check." Webb lied, his voice cracking under the immense, suffocating pressure. "I never agreed to falsify any official medical records. You have absolutely no proof of this ridiculous conspiracy." Mitchell smiled a dark, terrifying smile. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of printed paper, sliding it across the table. It was a highly detailed bank wire confirmation showing the exact routing numbers and the massive $50,000 transfer from Cynthia's secret account directly into Webb's offshore shell account. Engaging in a deliberate conspiracy to unlawfully institutionalize a perfectly sane individual for illicit financial gain is a severe federal felony, Mitchell explained, reciting the law with brutal precision. It carries a minimum mandatory sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. It also triggers the absolute, immediate, and permanent revocation of your state medical license. You will never practice medicine again. You will lose your practice, your luxury cars, your home, and your absolute freedom. Dr. Webb stared at the wire transfer receipt, his entire body trembling violently. He looked exactly like a trapped rat staring at a descending guillotine. He knew Mitchell was not bluffing. He knew I held his entire life in the palm of my hand. "What do you want me to do?" Webb whispered, staring blindly at the floor. I looked at him feeling absolute, complete disgust for a man who would sell an innocent person's freedom for a quick payday. "I want you to stand up, walk out that front door, and never answer another phone call from my toxic family ever again." I instructed my voice to be low and dangerous. "If you ever breathe a single word of this interaction to Cynthia or Dominic, Mitchell will file the criminal complaints with the district attorney before the sun sets. You are completely, entirely invisible to us now. Do you understand?" Webb nodded frantically, dropping the thick medical dossier directly onto the floor. He did not even bother to pick it up. He scrambled to his feet, practically tripping over the expensive rug, and ran straight down the hallway. He yanked the heavy front door open and fled out into the morning sunlight, leaving the door wide open in his frantic, desperate escape. A few seconds later, I heard the loud, aggressive screeching of his car tires as he sped recklessly down the quiet suburban street, terrified for his absolute life. I stood up and calmly walked over to the front door, pushing it firmly shut and locking the deadbolt once again. The house returned to a deep, absolute silence. I walked back into the living room. Cynthia was still deeply unconscious on the sofa, completely unaware that her master plan had just been entirely dismantled and weaponized against her. She would likely sleep for another 5 or 6 hours under the massive weight of her own chemical trap. Mitchell calmly reached across the chessboard and captured my white knight with his black bishop. He checked his heavy silver watch, observing the exact time. "It is time to freeze their oxygen," Mitchell said, his voice devoid of any mercy or hesitation. I nodded slowly, looking at the empty glass of orange juice resting on the dining room table. Dominic and Allison were currently speeding around the city, entirely blinded by their own toxic arrogance, firmly believing they were untouchable kings because of their new $5 million loan. They had absolutely no idea they had already broken the core covenant of that hostile contract the moment Allison embezzled those funds to buy her flashy new sports car. "Execute the financial veto I commanded. cut every single active card, freeze the primary corporate accounts, plunge them into absolute total financial darkness. Let the real game finally begin. It was early Thursday afternoon, and the high-end luxury shopping district downtown was bustling with wealthy patrons enjoying the crisp autumn air. Allison walked through the heavy, towering glass doors of the most exclusive jewelry boutique in the city, carrying several massive designer shopping bags from her earlier spending spree. She was completely intoxicated by the massive $5 million loan her husband had secured just days ago, firmly believing she was now absolute untouchable royalty. She felt completely vindicated, thinking she had finally proven her pathetic father-in-law completely wrong. She did not even bother to greet the impeccably dressed sales associate standing politely near the entrance. She marched directly to the center glass display case, her high heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. She pointed her perfectly manicured finger at a massive $50,000 diamond necklace resting on a black velvet display cushion. "Wrap it up right now," she commanded, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet, elegant store. The sales associate offered a highly professional smile and politely asked if she wanted to try the magnificent piece first to see how it rested against her collarbone. Allison simply rolled her eyes in deep annoyance and slapped Dominic's heavy black corporate credit card directly onto the pristine glass counter, leaving a noticeable smudge. "I do not need to try it on," she snapped impatiently, waving her hand dismissively. "Just charge the card and put it in a nice box. I have a very busy schedule today, and I absolutely do not have time to stand around waiting for the retail staff to do their basic minimum wage jobs." The associate maintained his tight, polite smile, picked up the heavy metal card, and walked over to the sleek digital checkout terminal. Allison stood tapping her designer heels against the floor, already imagining the intensely jealous looks she would get from her wealthy friends at the country club this weekend. She had absolutely no idea that Mitchell, my ruthless attorney, had just executed the financial veto perfectly, severing her entirely from the massive pool of stolen money. The quiet, elegant atmosphere of the jewelry boutique was suddenly pierced by a sharp, harsh electronic beep. The small screen on the checkout terminal flashed a bright, angry red. The sales associate frowned slightly and carefully wiped the magnetic strip of the heavy black card on his suit jacket before inserting it into the machine a second time. The machine immediately emitted another loud, unforgiving beep. "I am incredibly sorry, madam," the associate said, keeping his voice low and highly professional so as not to embarrass her. "It appears this specific corporate card has been completely declined by your financial institution. Would you happen to have another form of payment we could use for this large transaction?" Allison stared at him as if he had just slapped her violently across the face. "Declined," she practically shrieked, her voice completely shattering the peaceful, luxurious atmosphere of the boutique. "That is absolutely impossible and completely absurd. That is an elite executive corporate account with millions of dollars in available liquid funds. Your cheap little machine is obviously broken, or you do not know how to operate it. Run it again, and this time do it correctly before I have you fired." The associate let out a quiet, controlled breath, maintaining his professional composure, and ran the heavy card a third time. The result was exactly the same. The bright red declined message glowed harshly on the digital screen. He turned the terminal around so Allison could clearly see the digital rejection for herself. "I assure you, madam, our merchant systems are operating perfectly," the associate explained calmly. "The bank has placed a hard absolute block on this specific account." Allison snatched the black card out of his hand, her face flushing bright red with sudden explosive fury. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing, you incompetent fool," she snarled, opening her expensive designer handbag and pulling out her premium leather wallet. She aggressively slapped a silver platinum personal credit card onto the glass counter. "Use this one and hurry up. You are wasting my incredibly valuable time and trying my patience." The associate calmly picked up the second card and inserted the chip. Another loud, sharp beep echoed through the quiet store. Declined. He did not even get a single chance to speak before Allison threw a third card, a gold joint checking debit card, directly at his chest. The plastic card bounced off his dark suit jacket and hit the marble floor with a quiet clatter. "Pick it up and charge it," she screamed, her voice now completely unhinged and echoing out into the street. The other wealthy customers in the boutique had completely stopped shopping and were now openly staring at the massive unfolding spectacle. The associate slowly bent down, picked up the gold card and swiped it through the terminal. The machine beeped instantly. Declined. 3 different cards from 3 different banks, all completely entirely frozen. Allison's blinding arrogance instantly morphed into total, uncontrollable rage. She flatly refused to believe her endless supply of stolen money had just vanished into thin air. She slammed both her hands violently against the delicate glass display case, making the expensive diamond jewelry inside rattle dangerously. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at the associate's face. "My husband just secured a $5 million private investment from Philip Lancaster himself. We could buy this entire pathetic little store and fire every single one of you useless peasants. You are deliberately doing this to humiliate me because you are deeply jealous of my massive wealth. You are nothing but a minimum wage servant trying to embarrass me in public because your own life is completely pathetic." Her shrill, aggressive voice echoed out into the busy street, drawing the intense attention of dozens of people walking past the large store windows. Several wealthy customers inside the boutique immediately pulled out their expensive smartphones and began quietly recording the massive public meltdown. Allison did not care at all. She felt completely entitled to the diamond necklace, and she was demanding absolute total submission from the retail staff. "Fetch your senior manager right this second," she demanded, stomping her foot like a completely spoiled toddler throwing a massive temper tantrum. "I want you fired immediately, and I want that $50,000 diamond necklace given to me entirely for free as basic compensation for this horrific emotional distress you have intentionally caused me." A tall, sharply dressed man walked out from the back office suite. He was the senior boutique manager, and he possessed an intense aura of absolute no-nonsense authority. He had dealt with entitled, wealthy individuals for 20 years, and he did not apologize or cower in the face of her violent, hysterical screaming. He calmly stepped behind the glass counter, picked up the heavy black corporate card she had originally presented, and looked down at the glowing terminal screen. The machine was not just declining the massive transaction due to insufficient funds. The global banking system had sent a very specific high-priority security code directly to the merchant terminal. The manager looked up and stared directly into Allison's furious, bloodshot eyes. "Madam," said his voice, projecting absolute cold finality that silenced the entire store, "this corporate account has not just been declined for lack of funds. The issuing commercial bank has permanently flagged this specific card and all associated accounts for severe suspected financial fraud. We have been legally instructed by the federal financial institution to retain and destroy this card immediately." Allison gasped in pure, absolute horror as the manager calmly reached under the polished counter, pulled out a heavy pair of steel industrial scissors, and cut the elite black corporate card cleanly in half right in front of her shocked face. He casually dropped the two useless plastic pieces directly into the trash can. Dozens of bright camera flashes went off simultaneously as the surrounding customers recorded her absolute total public humiliation. "Get out of my store immediately, or I will have mall security forcibly remove you," the manager commanded, pointing directly toward the heavy glass doors. Allison grabbed her designer shopping bags, her hands shaking completely out of control, and fled the boutique in total absolute disgrace, pushing past the laughing crowd. She stood outside on the busy concrete sidewalk, completely hyperventilating as strangers pointed and whispered at her. She aggressively pulled out her expensive smartphone and frantically dialed Dominic's private office number. He answered on the very first ring, but he did not sound like the arrogant, confident tech CEO anymore. "Dominic! Someone just cut up my corporate card!" Allison cried hysterically into the phone, tears of pure humiliation streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "What is going on with the money?" Dominic's voice came through the small speaker, completely shattered by pure animal panic and overwhelming terror. "It is all gone, Allison," he screamed, his voice cracking in absolute blind terror. "The bank just locked every single corporate account we have. Everything is completely frozen solid. They are aggressively investigating us for massive financial fraud, and the private lenders are already demanding their entire $5 million back by the end of the day." Exactly 35 minutes after Allison experienced her total public humiliation at the downtown jewelry boutique, my front door flew open with massive violent force. The heavy oak wood crashed loudly against the interior wall, shaking the picture frames in the hallway. Dominic sprinted into the grand foyer like a completely hunted animal. He did not look like an elite, confident tech CEO anymore. His expensive silk tie was torn completely loose. His custom designer shirt was completely soaked in cold, terrified sweat, and his eyes were wide with pure, absolute blind panic. He had just received the automated emergency alerts from his commercial bank confirming the absolute worst-case scenario. Every single penny of his liquid assets was completely frozen solid under a severe federal fraud investigation. His corporate credit lines were dead, his personal checking accounts were locked. He completely ignored me sitting calmly in the leather armchair near the window. He did not even bother to ask why his mother was currently groaning and holding her head on the living room sofa. He had complete and absolute tunnel vision. His entire pathetic existence was currently entirely focused on the massive steel wall safe hidden inside my private library. He firmly believed that the emergency medical proxy and power of attorney documents he had locked inside that safe during my birthday party were his ultimate salvation. He thought he could just grab that thick leather folder and march directly into the bank manager's office and demand full immediate access to all my private accounts by officially declaring me legally incompetent. He ran straight down the hallway, his expensive leather shoes slipping frantically on the polished hardwood floor. I stood up slowly, adjusting my tailored suit jacket, and walked quietly behind him. I did not rush. I had absolutely nothing to fear from this desperate man. By the time I reached the open doorway of the private library, Dominic was already on his knees, aggressively spinning the heavy combination dial of the steel safe. His hands were shaking so violently he could not line up the precise numbers correctly. He missed the first digit, then the second. He cursed loudly, slamming his closed fist against the cold metal door in pure, helpless frustration. Mother screamed, his voice cracking under the immense, suffocating pressure. "Mother, get in here right now!" Cynthia slowly pulled herself up from the living room sofa. She looked absolutely terrible. The massive, overwhelming dose of the heavy prescription sedative she had accidentally ingested had completely destroyed her elegant posture and sharp social focus. Her expensive silk dress was deeply wrinkled and stained with sweat. Her meticulously styled hair was a messy, chaotic bird's nest, and her eyes were heavily bloodshot and completely unfocused. She stumbled blindly down the hallway, leaning heavily against the painted walls just to keep herself upright. She felt incredibly nauseous, deeply dizzy, and completely disoriented from the powerful chemical haze lingering in her brain. "What is going on?" She slurred, her words running together in a thick, confused mess. "Why are you screaming, Dominic? Where is Dr. Webb? Why is your father not in a straitjacket being loaded into an ambulance?" Dominic did not care about her severe confusion or her obvious physical sickness. His toxic greed completely overrode any basic human empathy for his own mother. He grabbed her roughly by the arm and pulled her forcefully down to the floor right in front of the heavy steel safe. "Open it," he commanded, practically spitting the angry words directly into her face. My hands will not stop shaking. The bank just froze absolutely everything. They flagged the primary corporate accounts for severe financial fraud. The private lenders who gave us the $5 million yesterday are aggressively threatening to seize my house by tomorrow morning. I need that power of attorney document right now. If I do not walk into that bank and legally take control of Harlan's Shadow Trust today, I am going to federal prison for the rest of my miserable life. Open the safe, Cynthia. Cynthia blinked heavily, her drug-addled brain struggling violently to process the massive, catastrophic news. The words federal prison finally cut through her heavy sedation. She looked up at me, standing quietly in the doorway. My expression is perfectly cold and entirely unreadable. She finally realized that her brilliant master plan had completely failed. The corrupt doctor had not taken me away. I was not drooling on myself or mumbling at the walls. I was standing there fully dressed, perfectly alert, and holding absolutely all the power. A sudden massive spike of pure, desperate adrenaline briefly cleared her vision. She leaned forward, her trembling fingers grasping the cold steel dial. She took a deep, ragged breath, trying to steady her racing heart, and slowly inputted the 6-digit security code. A loud, sharp mechanical click echoed through the quiet library. The heavy internal steel bolts retracted with a smooth, heavy thud. Dominic did not even wait for her to pull the door open. He shoved his sick mother aside aggressively, yanking the heavy metal door wide open himself. He reached his shaking hands inside the dark compartment and grabbed the premium leather folder, clutching it tightly to his chest like a drowning man holding onto a life preserver in a raging ocean. He stood up, breathing incredibly fast and ragged. He looked directly at me, a twisted, highly arrogant smile spreading across his pale, sweating face. His fear briefly morphed back into his standard toxic superiority. "You thought you could actually destroy me?" he sneered, his voice dripping with venomous, triumphant joy. "You thought you could just anonymously freeze my accounts and watch me burn to the ground? You are a pathetic, worthless old fool, Harlan. I have the absolute power of attorney right here in my hands. I am leaving this house right now, getting into my car, going straight to your bank and legally taking every single penny you have ever earned. You are nothing but a helpless ward of the state now. I am the absolute master of this family, and you are going to die in a cheap public nursing home." I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not move a single muscle to stop him from leaving. I simply offered a very faint, cold smile and casually gestured toward the heavy leather folder with my right hand. "You should really double-check your important paperwork before you try to threaten a federal bank manager, Dominic." I suggested. My tone is perfectly calm and even. Business is business, after all. Dominic scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes at my absolute calm demeanor. He firmly believed I was just bluffing, desperately trying to delay the inevitable. He aggressively flipped the heavy leather cover open, preparing to read the severe legal clauses back to me just to savor his final total victory. He stared down at the first thick page of the document. He completely stopped breathing. He blinked rapidly, aggressively, rubbing his eyes as if his vision was suddenly failing him in the dim light of the library. He frantically flipped to the second page. Then he ripped the third page over. Then the fourth. He tore through the thick stack of premium legal paper, his breathing instantly turning into sharp, terrified, violent gasps. Every single page was completely entirely blank. The intricate, dense legal jargon was still printed clearly on the edges of the pages, but all the vital signature lines where I had supposedly signed my legal name in front of 80 wealthy witnesses were completely white. There were absolutely no signatures. There were no initials. The highly advanced disappearing security ink from my vintage fountain pen had completely evaporated into the surrounding oxygen without leaving a single trace behind. There was absolutely no power of attorney. There was absolutely no emergency medical proxy. There was nothing but a useless, expensive stack of completely blank paper. Dominic dropped the heavy leather folder. The blank pages scattered wildly across the polished hardwood floor like dead autumn leaves. He looked down at his own violently trembling hands, finally realizing the absolute horrifying truth. He had absolutely no legal power over me. He could not march into the bank. He could not steal my shadow trust. He was completely securely locked out of the money forever. The massive steel trap had just snapped completely shut, perfectly sealing his fate. Pure absolute panic set in as the heavy, crushing weight of the $5 million debt and the impending federal fraud charges finally broke his mind. The blank papers remained scattered across my library floor long after Dominic fled my house in absolute terror. He ran back to his car completely shattered, but his nightmare was only just beginning. The modern global financial system operates with cold, absolute, ruthless efficiency, completely devoid of human emotion or mercy. By late Thursday afternoon, the automated clearinghouse executed its routine daily sweeps across all major commercial bank accounts. The massive $5 million private loan Dominic had so arrogantly signed with the offshore shell company required a mandatory, immediate good faith transfer of exactly $50,000 to properly establish the active repayment channel. The digital request hit Dominic's primary corporate account at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Because my attorney Mitchell had already successfully frozen every single one of his accounts under severe federal fraud investigations, the banking system instantly rejected the massive transfer request. The payment bounced violently, generating a rapid cascade of automated red flags across multiple interconnected financial institutions. Dominic was sitting alone in his dark, quiet office, staring blankly at his computer monitor when the massive red failed payment notification flashed across his screen. The loud electronic chime sounded like a death knell in the empty room. He was officially in breach of contract. He had lasted less than 48 hours before completely defaulting on the most aggressive predatory loan ever drafted in the history of corporate finance. His arrogant assumption that he could simply outsmart the system had just triggered the ultimate final trap. The absolute second the electronic payment failed, Mitchell was instantly notified. He was sitting in his pristine downtown corner office, watching his secure financial terminal with the cold, calculated patience of a seasoned apex predator. He did not waste a single minute. He immediately drafted the formal notice of absolute default and flawlessly executed the immediate debt recall clause buried deep within the 50-page commercial contract. Dominic had arrogantly assumed the severe fraud covenants only applied to future crimes committed after the ink was dry. He did not realize that stealing my joint retirement money by forging my signature earlier that month constituted an active, undeclared federal felony, completely violating the strict morality clauses he had blindly agreed to. Mitchell dispatched a specialized federal courier directly to Dominic's massive suburban home. The courier arrived just as Allison was pacing the massive living room, screaming into her phone at a terrified bank representative over her destroyed credit cards. She aggressively snatched the heavy legal envelope from the courier and ripped it open, fully expecting an apology letter or a replacement card. Instead, she found a stark, terrifying legal demand printed on heavy corporate stock. The shell company was officially invoking its absolute right to total immediate asset forfeiture. Because of the documented active forgery and the immediate first payment default, the entire $5 million principal, plus massive punitive late penalties, was now fully due within exactly 24 hours. If the massive funds were not completely transferred by Friday evening, the holding company would automatically seize their house, their bank accounts, their investment portfolios, and every single piece of corporate intellectual property Dominic possessed. Allison stared at the terrifying document, her entire body going completely numb as the blood drained from her face. She frantically called Dominic, screaming the severe legal demands aloud into the phone. Dominic could not even formulate a coherent, rational response. He was completely trapped in a burning building with absolutely no exits and all the windows securely barred. His tech company was entirely dead. His personal wealth was entirely imaginary, built on a fragile foundation of massive toxic debt. And the federal authorities were actively building a massive airtight criminal case against him for the retirement account theft. The brutal realization hit him with the crushing, unstoppable force of a runaway freight train. He could not borrow his way out of this massive hole. He could not forge another signature to delay the inevitable. He was facing total, absolute financial annihilation and a very lengthy federal prison sentence. He desperately tried to call the private equity underwriter, begging for a simple grace period or a temporary extension, but the phone number had already been completely disconnected. The automated voice informed him the line was no longer in service. The ghost company had entirely vanished into the digital ether, leaving behind nothing but a massive steel trap wrapped incredibly tightly around his neck. The brutal financial consequences did not even wait for the sun to rise. At exactly 2 a.m, the loud, aggressive grinding of heavy diesel engines woke Allison and Dominic from their fitful, terrified sleep. They rushed to their bedroom window and looked down at their expansive, manicured driveway. 3 large industrial tow trucks were actively hooking heavy, thick steel chains to their massive luxury fleet. The brand-new custom sports car Allison had just purchased with the stolen funds was already secured tightly to the back of a flatbed truck. Dominic ran outside barefoot in his pajamas, screaming violently into the cold night air and waving his arms frantically. The cold collection agents completely ignored his unhinged screaming, simply handing him a highly detailed court-ordered repossession mandate explicitly authorized by the defaulted contract clauses. They drove away into the dark night, leaving Dominic and Allison standing shivering in their empty driveway, completely stripped of their fake royal status. Neighbors were peering through their blinds, watching the total, absolute public humiliation unfold. Total, absolute desperation completely shattered whatever remained of their fragile sanity. They had absolutely nothing left to lose. Dominic frantically called his sister Valerie, who was currently suffering her own massive financial collapse after violating her guarantor terms, and dragged his sick, disoriented mother Cynthia into his cheap, leased rental car. As the dark, heavy clouds of early Friday morning rolled rapidly over the city, the entire toxic family loaded into a single vehicle. Their faces were twisted with pure, violent rage and complete, unhinged desperation. They were driving directly toward my estate, determined to break down my front door and force me to save them by any brutal means necessary. The final violent confrontation was officially beginning. The heavy oak front door of my estate did not just open. It was violently kicked inward, crashing against the wall with a deafening crack that echoed through the quiet morning. I remained perfectly seated in my favorite leather armchair by the large living room window, watching the storm finally arrive. Dominic burst into the foyer looking completely unhinged. His eyes were wild, heavily bloodshot from lack of sleep and pure panic. Right behind him was Allison, her face twisted into a mask of absolute feral rage. Valerie followed closely, dragging her feet, looking like a terrified child who had just lost her favorite toy. Finally, Cynthia stumbled through the doorway, leaning heavily against the doorframe, still visibly struggling with the lingering effects of the massive sedative she had ingested the day before. They had spent the last 3 hours watching everything they owned being legally stripped away piece by piece. The massive tow trucks had taken their luxury cars right out of their driveway while their wealthy neighbors watched in complete shock. Valerie had lost her entire cosmetic company overnight and was completely bankrupt. Now they were completely cornered, entirely out of options, and running on pure toxic adrenaline. They did not look like a proud, wealthy suburban family anymore. They looked like a desperate pack of starving wolves. Allison did not even wait to catch her breath before she started screaming. She pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face, hurling every single vicious obscenity she could think of. She blamed me entirely for her brand new sports car being towed away in the middle of the night. She shrieked that I was a completely useless, pathetic old man who had deliberately ruined their perfect lives. "Sell this house right now, Harlan," she screamed, her voice cracking in pure hysterical fury. "Call your real estate agent this exact second and list this property. We need $5 million by tonight, and you are going to give it to us. You are going to sell absolutely everything you own to save us from this nightmare." I did not flinch at her violent screaming. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against her toxic, unhinged insults. I simply sat quietly, resting my hands on the smooth leather armrests, observing their complete psychological collapse. My absolute calm demeanor only infuriated them further. Cynthia finally pushed her way past Allison, stumbling into the center of the living room. She looked absolutely dreadful, her usually perfect hair hanging in greasy strands, her expensive dress stained and deeply wrinkled. But despite her weakened physical state, her blinding arrogance remained completely intact. She glared at me with absolute contempt, expecting me to immediately submit to her aggressive demands just as she had conditioned me to do for the past decade. "You will do exactly as she says," Harlan, Cynthia commanded, her voice slurring slightly but dripping with heavy venom. "You will call the bank. You will empty your pathetic little retirement accounts, and you will put this massive house on the market today. You owe this family everything. You are absolutely nothing without me. I built your social standing. I gave you children. I tolerated your boring, cheap existence for 40 years. You are a complete relic who has spent his entire life hoarding wealth while we struggled to build our modern empires. If you do not fix this massive financial mess right now, I swear I will personally make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life entirely alone and completely forgotten." Her vicious words hung heavily in the quiet air of the living room. Dominic stepped forward aggressively, cracking his knuckles, trying to physically intimidate me. He told me the vanishing ink trick was a cute little stunt, but it did not change the brutal reality that they were taking over. He demanded I hand over the physical deed to the estate immediately. I looked at each of them slowly, taking in their desperate, angry faces. They truly believed they could still bully their way into my vault. They thought loud voices and physical threats could undo the massive legal steel trap that had already crushed their fake empire. I reached into the side pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black remote control. I did not say a single word. I simply pointed the remote directly at the massive flat-screen television mounted above the stone fireplace and pressed the center button. The large screen instantly flared to life. It did not show a video. The screen remained entirely black, displaying only a single audio waveform pulsing in the center. The high-definition surround sound speakers mounted in the ceiling crackled sharply before a crystal-clear recording began to play. It was the exact audio file I had captured using the vintage brass heating vent in my study just a few nights ago. Dominic's heavy, exhausted voice filled the living room, clearly slurring from alcohol. Then Allison's cold, flat, ruthless voice echoed through the high ceilings. "We cannot wait for the bank to foreclose, Dominic." The recorded voice of Allison whispered sharply. "Your father is clearly losing his mind. We need to call that private doctor I found. Have him evaluated. Pay the doctor to declare him legally incompetent. Once he is diagnosed with severe dementia, your mother will easily get emergency power of attorney. We drain his retirement accounts. We mortgage this house and we save your company. He gets locked away in a nice, quiet medical facility and we get our lives back. It is the only way to survive this." Then the recording captured Dominic's long, terrifying pause before his final brutal whisper of agreement. "Do it." The crystal-clear audio stopped. The television screen went entirely black again. I placed the small black remote control gently onto the glass coffee table and looked back up at my family. The massive living room went completely dead silent. The heavy, suffocating quiet was so absolute you could hear the faint ticking of my mechanical watch from across the room. Valerie covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with total horror as she finally realized exactly how deep the toxic betrayal truly went. Cynthia stared blankly at the dark television screen, her drug-clouded mind struggling to process the massive, irrefutable evidence of their brutal criminal conspiracy being played out loud. Allison looked completely terrified, practically shrinking behind her husband as she realized her most vicious secret had been captured perfectly on tape. But Dominic was far too gone. He was entirely consumed by pure blind desperation. His massive unpayable debt and the impending federal fraud charges had completely destroyed his ability to reason. Instead of feeling shame or remorse, he doubled down on his toxic arrogance. A dark, twisted sneer slowly spread across his sweating face. "You think you are some kind of genius mastermind playing a game of chess with our lives?" Dominic spat, taking another aggressive step toward my chair, completely ignoring the massive legal threat the recording represented. "That audio recording does not mean absolutely anything in the real world. You illegally recorded a private conversation in your own house. It is completely inadmissible in any court. It does not change the cold, hard fact that we are going to sell this property today. You are just a frail coward sitting alone in a chair. You have absolutely no real power here, and you cannot stop us from taking what is rightfully ours." I remained perfectly still, looking past Dominic toward the grand foyer. I did not need to answer him. I did not need to defend my power. Because right at that exact moment, the sharp, unmistakable sound of heavy, confident footsteps began echoing loudly from the long hallway behind them. Someone else had just entered the house. The heavy, confident footsteps grew incredibly loud, echoing sharply off the polished marble floors of the grand foyer. Dominic turned around, still wearing his highly arrogant, twisted sneer, fully expecting to see local law enforcement or a frightened real estate agent answering his aggressive demands. Instead, the tall, towering, imposing figure of Philip Lancaster stepped directly into the bright living room. The billionaire was dressed in an immaculate dark charcoal suit, his massive physical presence instantly commanding the entire space. Right behind him was Mitchell Reed, my ruthless corporate attorney, carrying a heavy black leather briefcase. The sudden, unexpected appearance of the city's most powerful financial titan in my quiet suburban living room hit my entire family like a massive physical shockwave. Dominic's arrogant sneer vanished instantly, melting into a look of absolute profound confusion. He actually thought Philip Lancaster had somehow come to rescue him from his financial ruin. Dominic took a quick, desperate step forward, frantically smoothing his wrinkled shirt, trying to look like a competent executive in front of his absolute idol. "Mr. Lancaster," Dominic stammered, his voice shaking with desperate, pathetic hope. "I cannot believe you are actually here right now. There has been a massive, terrible misunderstanding with the loan your associate provided me yesterday. My bank accounts were frozen maliciously and the automated payment bounced, but I can explain absolutely everything to you. If you just give me one single week, I can fix this entire situation and prove my worth." Lancaster completely ignored Dominic. He did not even look at my son. The billionaire walked right past the desperate, sweating man, stepping gracefully into the center of the large room. He stopped directly in front of my leather armchair. He slowly removed his expensive dark hat and offered me a deep, highly respectful bow. "It is an absolute honor to see you again, Mr. Hayes," Lancaster said, his deep voice echoing in the dead silent room. My family stared at the unbelievable scene unfolding right in front of their very eyes. Cynthia let out a weak, confused gasp, clutching the heavy fabric of the living room sofa. Allison backed away slowly, her terrified eyes darting frantically between my quiet-seated form and the towering billionaire. Valerie stood completely frozen, entirely unable to process why the man they all worshipped was currently bowing to the father they all completely despised. Lancaster turned his cold, sharp gaze toward my son. "You are an incredibly foolish, ignorant young man," Lancaster stated, his voice vibrating with absolute, unfiltered disdain. "You stand in this magnificent house screaming at a man whose shoes you are not even worthy to shine. You came to my restaurant and begged me for money to save your pathetic, failing tech company. You blindly signed a $5 million commercial loan agreement with an offshore private equity firm. You completely surrendered all your assets, your luxury vehicles, and your personal freedom to that holding company without ever bothering to look up who actually owned the massive firm." Dominic swallowed hard, a cold, terrified sweat breaking out across his forehead. "What are you talking about?" Dominic whispered, his voice barely audible in the tense room. Lancaster gestured respectfully toward me, keeping his posture perfectly straight. "He is talking about me," I said, remaining perfectly calm and seated in my armchair. "I instructed Mitchell to create that offshore shell corporation on Monday morning. I personally authorized the $5 million wire transfer that you and your incredibly greedy wife practically killed yourselves to accept. I am the private equity firm Dominic. I am the massive anonymous debt collector who just legally towed your luxury cars away in the dark middle of the night. The large room began to violently spin for my family. Valerie dropped directly to her knees, completely unable to support her own weight anymore. Cynthia shook her head violently, flatly, refusing to believe the massive, horrifying truth standing right in front of her. "That is completely impossible," Cynthia slurred weakly, her drug-clouded mind rejecting reality. "He is just a retired logistics manager. He does not have $5 million to lend anyone. He bought his ugly, cheap watch from a dirty pawn shop." Lancaster let out a cold, dark laugh that physically chilled the entire room. "That watch is a founder's token," Lancaster explained, turning to face my deeply confused wife. 35 years ago, 3 visionary men provided the massive silent capital required to build the entire Lancaster real estate empire from the ground up. Elias Hayes was the absolute primary financial architect. When he passed away, he transferred his massive shadow trust entirely to his only son. Harlan Hayes is not a retired logistics manager. He is the silent majority shareholder of the Lancaster Group. He technically owns every single skyscraper, every commercial bank, and every massive development project my public company currently operates. I work for him. The brutal, crushing reality finally slammed into my family with the destructive absolute force of a massive falling meteor. The quiet old man they had relentlessly mocked, abused, and actively tried to lock away in a sterile psychiatric ward was actually the supreme master of the entire financial universe they so desperately worshipped. They had spent decades treating me like a pathetic burden, completely unaware that I was the only reason they had a roof over their heads or food on their tables. Allison began aggressively hyperventilating, clutching her chest as a massive, severe panic attack seized her lungs. She finally realized the $50,000 diamond necklace she tried to buy was funded by my own stolen money. Cynthia buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the massive scale of her own catastrophic failure finally broke her completely. She had actually tried to poison a billionaire to steal a tiny fraction of his own wealth. Dominic physically collapsed, unable to hold himself up any longer. His knees hit the polished hardwood floor with a heavy, loud thud. He looked up at me, tears of absolute pure terror streaming rapidly down his pale face. He finally understood the massive, inescapable legal trap he had blindly walked directly into. "But the deed to this house," Dominic cried, desperately grasping at the very last tiny shred of delusional hope he had left in his shattered mind. "We can still force you to sell this estate to cover the commercial default. I have the power of attorney, even if the ink completely vanishes from the paper. I am still your legal next of kin, and you owe me this house." Mitchell Reed stepped forward, unsnapping the heavy brass locks on his black leather briefcase with a loud, sharp click. He reached inside and pulled out a single, thick, legal document printed on heavy archival paper. "You have absolutely no legal rights to this property or any other asset," Mitchell declared, his voice ringing with absolute cold finality. 20 years ago, my client placed this entire estate and every single liquid asset he visibly owned into an impenetrable, ironclad, revocable trust. He is the sole absolute trustee and the sole beneficiary. Your fraudulent mortgages, your empty safe, and your loud, desperate physical threats are completely, utterly meaningless under federal law. You do not own a single brick of this massive house. You do not own the expensive luxury cars you drove here. You do not even own the expensive designer clothes currently resting on your backs. You have absolutely nothing. Dominic let out a loud, agonizing scream of pure, total defeat, echoing loudly through the massive, empty halls of the magnificent house he would never own. Dominic's agonizing scream faded into a pathetic, hollow whimper, echoing against the high ceilings of my grand foyer. He remained crumpled on the polished hardwood floor, a completely broken man entirely consumed by his own monumental failure. Philip Lancaster looked down at him with an expression of pure, icy disgust, before stepping back, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the pathetic display. But the most violent reaction did not come from the powerful billionaire, or from my ruthless attorney. It came directly from the woman who had proudly sworn to stand by Dominic for better or for worse. The severe panic attack that had gripped Allison just moments ago abruptly vanished. As she stared down at her husband weeping miserably on the floor, the terrifying reality of their situation completely crystallized in her highly calculated mind. Dominic was not a brilliant tech CEO temporarily down on his luck. He was a massive financial black hole. He held a $5 million unpayable debt and was actively facing severe federal felony charges. Every single delusion of grandeur she had wrapped her entire identity around shattered into a million sharp pieces. Allison slowly lowered her trembling hands from her face. Her breathing steadied, but her eyes turned incredibly cold and reptilian. She looked at the man she had married with a level of pure, unfiltered revulsion that actually chilled the air in the room. Dominic looked up at her, his face completely covered in sweat and tears, desperately reaching a trembling hand out toward her ankle. "Allison helped me," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "We can fight this together. You have powerful family connections. We can hire elite defense lawyers and find a massive legal loophole. Please do not look at me like that." Allison snatched her leg back as if he were a highly venomous snake trying to strike her. She took 3 large steps backward, completely distancing herself from his toxic radioactive presence. "Do not touch me, you pathetic liar," she hissed, her voice completely devoid of any human empathy or warmth. "Fight this together. Are you entirely out of your mind? There is absolutely no fighting this. You forged federal banking documents. You stole money from an old man. You blindly signed away our entire lives to a ghost company without even reading the fine print. You are not a visionary tech genius, Dominic. You are a completely incompetent, massive fraud, and you have completely ruined my perfect life." Dominic stared at her, completely stunned by the rapid, brutal pivot. He had spent their entire marriage buying her expensive cars, designer handbags, and lavish European vacations, just to keep her happy. The absolute second the stolen money stopped flowing, her completely conditional love instantly evaporated into thin air. "But we are legally married," Dominic pleaded, practically choking on his own desperate tears. "We are supposed to be a massive power couple. We are supposed to conquer this city together." Allison let out a harsh, vicious bark of laughter that sounded completely unhinged. A power couple, she mocked, looking around the massive, expensive house she would never own. "Power couples actually have money, Dominic. You have absolutely nothing but a $5 million anchor tied directly around your neck. I did not marry you to live in a cheap, cramped apartment. I did not marry you to spend the next 10 years visiting you behind thick safety glass in a federal penitentiary. I married a successful executive, and you are currently nothing but a completely bankrupt criminal facing total ruin." She reached down to her left hand, her fingers aggressively gripping the massive, incredibly expensive diamond engagement ring and the matching platinum wedding band she wore so proudly. She twisted them violently, ripping them completely off her finger. She threw the heavy, expensive jewelry directly at Dominic's face with incredible force. The heavy diamond struck him sharply right on the cheekbone, leaving a visible red mark before clattering loudly onto the polished hardwood floor and rolling away into the dark corners of the room. "I am calling my private divorce attorney the absolute second I walk out of this house," Allison declared, turning her back on him completely. "I am filing for total, absolute separation, and I am telling the federal authorities exactly what you did to save myself. I will not let your pathetic stupidity drag my perfect reputation down into the gutter." She stomped aggressively over to the entryway where she had dropped her incredibly expensive custom designer handbag during her initial violent entrance. She snatched it off a small wooden side table, flipping her hair over her shoulder. She fully intended to walk right out the front door, call an expensive private black car service, and check herself into a luxury downtown hotel suite under her maiden name until the massive legal explosion completely blew over. She firmly believed she could simply shed Dominic like a cheap, dirty coat and seamlessly slide right back into her comfortable high society life, completely untouched by his massive financial ruin. She stepped right over her sobbing mother-in-law, Cynthia, completely ignoring the older woman's pathetic groans. Allison reached out her perfectly manicured hand, completely ready to grab the heavy brass handle of my front door and make her grand, dramatic exit. But she never touched the brass. Mitchell Reed stepped smoothly and deliberately directly into her path. The tall, highly intimidating corporate attorney completely blocked the large doorway, standing like a massive, impenetrable stone wall. "Excuse me," Allison snapped, her arrogant entitlement violently flaring up again. "Move out of my way right this second. I have absolutely nothing to do with this miserable family anymore. I am leaving this house immediately." Mitchell did not move a single inch. He looked down at her with the exact same cold, calculating expression a scientist uses to observe an incredibly foolish insect trapped inside a small glass jar. "You are absolutely not going anywhere," Mrs. Hayes Mitchell stated, his voice incredibly low and entirely devoid of any mercy. You seem to be operating under the completely false delusion that you are somehow an innocent bystander in this massive financial wreckage. Mitchell unsnapped his heavy black leather briefcase a second time. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy packet of legal documents bearing the highly official embossed seal of the State Financial Regulatory Commission. He aggressively shoved the thick papers directly into Allison's chest, forcing her to reflexively grab them before they fell to the floor. "What is this garbage?" she demanded, looking down at the heavy legal text with deep confusion. "That is a federal asset seizure and permanent account freeze order," Mitchell explained, projecting his voice so everyone in the massive room could clearly hear her total absolute doom. "It was entirely executed by a federal judge exactly 1 hour ago. You see, Allison, when Dominic blindly signed that $5 million commercial loan agreement, you eagerly grabbed the pen and aggressively co-signed the document directly next to his name. You legally bound yourself to the exact same massive punitive covenants." Allison went completely still, her eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon printed on the front page. "But I did not know he was committing fraud." She stammered, her confident, arrogant voice instantly cracking under the sudden massive legal pressure. "I just signed it because he told me it was a standard business loan. I am a completely innocent spouse. I was manipulated into signing those papers." Mitchell smiled, a deeply terrifying, predatory smile. "Innocence requires a complete lack of participation," Mitchell countered sharply. "The absolute second those fraudulently obtained funds hit your joint account yesterday, you immediately transferred $200,000 directly into your own private checking account. You then drove to a luxury dealership and purchased a custom sports car in your own name. You bought tens of thousands of dollars in designer jewelry and high-end fashion. You did not just passively benefit from his massive financial crimes, Allison. You aggressively and eagerly spent the stolen money. You are an active, fully documented co-conspirator in a massive federal wire fraud operation." The thick legal documents slipped slowly from Allison's trembling hands, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. "Because of your highly documented active participation, the federal government has completely frozen every single personal asset you have." Mitchell continued, delivering the final, completely lethal blow. "Your private trust fund is completely locked. Your personal checking and savings accounts are frozen solid. Your credit cards have already been permanently canceled, as you unfortunately discovered at the boutique today. Every single piece of expensive jewelry and designer clothing you purchased with that stolen money belongs completely to my client." Allison stared at the attorney, her entire world completely collapsing into absolute total darkness. "You cannot do this to me," she whispered, her voice completely hollow and completely devoid of any remaining arrogance. "I come from a highly respected family. I have my own money. I have my own completely separate life." "You had your own money," Mitchell corrected her coldly. "Right now, you do not even have enough liquid currency to pay for a cheap taxi ride back to your heavily mortgaged empty house. You are completely tethered to the massive $5 million unpayable debt resting entirely on your husband's shoulders. If he goes to federal prison, you will be sitting in the very next cell for aggressively laundering the stolen money." Allison slowly backed away from the heavy front door, her entire body trembling violently, uncontrollably. She turned around and looked back at the massive living room. Dominic was still sobbing on the floor. Cynthia was completely broken on the sofa. Valerie was staring completely blankly at the wall. Allison was legally trapped. She could not run away to a luxury hotel. She could not call her wealthy high society friends to rescue her because they would instantly abandon her the second they smelled the massive federal fraud investigation. The crushing, terrifying poverty she completely, absolutely despised had just swallowed her entirely whole. She collapsed onto the floor right next to her completely ruined husband, covering her face and letting out a loud, agonizing scream of pure, absolute despair. The massive iron trap was now completely, undeniably full. Allison's agonizing scream of absolute despair faded into loud, heavy sobs echoing across the polished hardwood floor. Valerie watched her sister-in-law completely shatter and immediately recognized that her own survival was on the line. She had always been a master of manipulation, playing the quiet, innocent victim whenever the family dynamics turned violent or chaotic. Valerie took a cautious step forward, completely stepping over the emotional wreckage of her brother and his wife. She looked down at Dominic with profound disgust, deliberately distancing herself from his massive criminal failure. Daddy, Valerie pleaded, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured tears. "I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I did not know Dominic stole your retirement money. I did not know Cynthia tried to drug you and lock you away in a facility. They are completely toxic people. Daddy and I am so incredibly sorry they hurt you, but I am not like them. I am just a hardworking business owner trying to make you proud. Please, Daddy, you know how much my cosmetic company means to me. It is my entire life. I know you are angry with them, but please do not punish me for their horrible mistakes. I just need a few more weeks to get my supplier payments sorted out, and then I will pay you back every single penny of the guarantor loan. Please, Daddy, spare my company. You are a good man. You are not a monster who destroys his own daughter's dreams. She clasped her hands together, looking at me with wide, innocent eyes, entirely expecting me to fall for her sweet, vulnerable act just like I had done for decades. I looked at Valerie, feeling absolutely no paternal warmth. I did not see a frightened, innocent daughter. I saw a highly calculating parasite who had eagerly enabled my abuse whenever it directly benefited her own bank account. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I did not pull out a handkerchief to dry her fake tears. I pulled out a neatly folded copy of the thick 50-page guarantor contract she had blindly signed earlier that week. I unfolded the heavy paper and placed it gently onto the glass coffee table right next to the small black remote control. You are absolutely right, Valerie, I said. My voice was perfectly calm and steady. I am not a monster. I am simply a highly disciplined businessman. And in the strict world of high finance, there are always severe consequences for failing to read the fine print. Valerie stared at this contract, a sudden flicker of genuine panic breaking through her carefully constructed, innocent facade. What do you mean? She asked, taking a hesitant step backward away from the table. Mitchell Reed stepped forward smoothly, adjusting his tailored suit tie. He looked at Valerie with the exact same predatory focus he had just used to completely dismantle Allison. Allow me to clarify the specific legal terms of your guarantor agreement. Valerie Mitchell offered, his tone razor-sharp and devoid of any mercy. When you hastily signed that document, you eagerly agreed to a total cross-collateralization clause intricately tied to a private shadow trust. You legally pledged 100% of your cosmetic company equity as absolute collateral against a single default event. Valerie shook her head aggressively, her fake tears instantly drying up. But I did not default on the loan, she argued, her voice rising in panicked pitch. The first payment to your ghost company is not even due until next month. I have not broken a single rule in that contract. You cannot just steal my business from me. Mitchell tapped his finger sharply against the middle paragraph of the open contract resting on the glass table. The hostile takeover clause was not solely tied to my client's loan, Mitchell corrected her coldly. It was legally tied to any documented fiscal delinquency across your entire corporate profile. Yesterday afternoon at exactly 3 o'clock, you failed to meet the mandatory invoice deadline for your primary chemical supplier in overseas manufacturing. Your international vendor officially flagged your account for severe non-payment and immediately halted your entire production line. That single missed vendor payment legally constituted a severe corporate default under Section 4, subsection 9 of this very contract. Valerie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in pure absolute horror. She distinctly remembered ignoring the frantic emails from her overseas supplier yesterday, arrogantly assuming she could just push their payments back another month while she spent her remaining cash on a luxury spa weekend. She had absolutely no idea that Mitchell had been aggressively monitoring her corporate vendor accounts, waiting patiently for her to make one single fatal mistake. Because you tripped the default wire. Mitchell continued delivering the crushing legal blow. The offshore shell company immediately executed the hostile takeover provision. As of 8 o'clock this morning, my client Harlan Hayes is the sole legal owner of your entire cosmetic brand. He completely owns your corporate bank accounts, your product patents, your massive warehouse inventory, and your entire customer database. You have been completely legally removed as the chief executive officer. You no longer own a single drop of foundation or a single tube of lipstick. Valerie looked like she had just been violently struck by a speeding train. She turned to me, her eyes wide with total, unadulterated terror. "Daddy, please," she begged, falling heavily to her knees right beside the glass coffee table. "You cannot do this to me. That company is my entire identity. I will do absolutely anything. I will sign a strict repayment plan. I will give you half the profits forever. Just please give me my company back. I worked so incredibly hard for it." "You did not work hard for anything, Valerie," I replied, looking down at her kneeling form. "You built a hollow vanity project using my money, and you ran it entirely into the ground because you cared far more about expensive vacations than paying your honest, hardworking suppliers. You happily watched Cynthia and Dominic actively plot to lock me in a psychiatric ward, and you said absolutely nothing because you desperately wanted your inheritance early. You only try to distance yourself from them now because they have completely lost their power. You are exactly like them and you deserve exactly the same fate. Mitchell reached into his heavy black briefcase one final time and pulled out a single sheet of stark white paper, placing it directly on top of the guarantor contract. He handed me a sleek black pen. This is the absolute final liquidation order Harlan Mitchell stated clearly for everyone in the room to hear. Your signature will instantly authorize the total immediate sale of all corporate assets to a massive international conglomerate. Valerie screamed loudly, lunging forward, trying to aggressively grab the pen from my hand. Mitchell easily caught her by the shoulder, holding her firmly back with absolute effortless strength. I leaned forward over the glass coffee table, pressing the tip of the pen firmly against the paper. I will not allow you to continue living a massive lie funded by my hard work, Valerie, I said without looking up at her terrified face. I signed my legal name with smooth, precise strokes. The dark ink soaked deep into the page, making the signature permanent. There was absolutely no vanishing ink this time. The total proceeds of this aggressive corporate liquidation, Mitchell announced. Picking up the signed document will not go into my client's personal accounts. Exactly $2.4 million will be securely wired directly to a national charity foundation dedicated entirely to rescuing and protecting elderly victims of severe domestic and financial abuse. You just single-handedly funded their entire operation for the next decade. Valerie completely collapsed. Her arms gave out and she fell face first onto the expensive living room rug, letting out a massive, agonizing wail of pure, total heartbreak. Her vanity, her fake innocence, and her entire corporate identity were completely erased by a single stroke of a pen. She was entirely bankrupt with absolutely no financial safety net and no family left to successfully manipulate ever again. She joined her broken brother and her ruined sister-in-law, sobbing hysterically on the floor, entirely crushed by the absolute heavy weight of her own toxic greed. The loud, agonizing wails of my completely ruined children and my permanently disgraced daughter-in-law filled the massive living room. Cynthia remained standing near the sofa for a few long, heavy moments, watching the absolute destruction of her entire toxic bloodline. The powerful, heavy chemical sedative still lingering in her system could not numb the pure, absolute terror suddenly gripping her heart. She slowly realized she was the very last one standing, and the massive crosshairs of my completely unforgiving justice were now resting entirely on her. Her blinding arrogance, the exact same arrogance she had used to humiliate me and treat me like a pathetic burden for the past decade, instantly vanished. It was entirely replaced by a sickeningly desperate survival instinct. She stumbled forward, her knees giving out completely before she even reached the edge of the glass coffee table. She fell heavily onto the expensive Persian rug, crawling frantically across the floor until she reached my leather armchair. She reached out with heavily trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of my tailored suit trousers, sobbing violently. Harlan pleaded, she begged, her voice completely cracking under the massive weight of her own absolute failure. You have made your point. You have completely punished them for their terrible mistakes. But please do not do this to me. We have been married for 40 incredibly long years. We built this entire family together. I have stood by your side through absolutely everything. You cannot just throw me away like I mean absolutely nothing to you. I am the mother of your children. Harlan, she cried, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes, mascara running heavily down her pale cheeks. You loved me once. You promised to protect me in front of God. I know they made horrible, greedy choices, but I was just trying to keep the family together. I was just trying to help our son survive his financial troubles. I am your wife. I did not pull my leg away from her desperate, grasping hands. I simply looked down at her with absolute freezing ice in my veins. You are not a wife, Cynthia, I replied, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or hesitation. You are the active, willing accomplice to a gang of absolute thieves. You did not stand by my side for 40 years. You stood heavily on my back, completely convinced I was too weak and pathetic to ever stand up and throw you off. She aggressively shook her head, denying the brutal truth right to the bitter end. That is not true, she sobbed frantically. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted Dominic to succeed. I never stole anything from you. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, bringing my face incredibly close to hers, so she could clearly see the absolute, complete absence of mercy in my eyes. Do not insult my intelligence by lying to me while you kneel on my floor. Cynthia, I stated, my tone razor-sharp. "I know exactly what you did at First Sterling Bank 32 days ago. I know you walked right into Arthur Gable's office with Dominic. I know you sat in that leather chair and looked the bank manager directly in the eyes, completely lying through your teeth. You told him I was bedridden with a severe respiratory illness. You used your status as a joint account holder to completely bypass the strict federal fraud flags. You provided the necessary secondary authorization so Dominic could flawlessly forge my signature and drain exactly $150,000 from our shared retirement safety net." Cynthia gasped loudly, her hands instantly flying to her mouth. She had absolutely no idea I knew the precise granular details of her massive financial betrayal. She thought her secret was completely safely buried deep within the banking system. She stared at me in complete absolute horror, realizing that I had known about her ultimate betrayal for days, and had simply sat in silence watching her spin her own lethal web. "You did not just passively watch Dominic steal my money," I continued, delivering the heavy, crushing facts like a relentless physical beating. "You actively, proudly facilitated the grand larceny. You helped him commit a severe federal felony to buy yourselves a few more weeks of fake luxury. And when you realized that stolen money was completely gone, you did not stop. You actively plotted with your unhinged daughter-in-law to have me declared legally insane. You hired Dr. Webb, a completely corrupt psychiatrist, to forcefully drag me out of my own home and lock me inside a sterile medical prison. You even organized a massive, lavish 69th birthday party for me just to create a theatrical stage. You stood in front of 80 wealthy socialites and pretended to be a loving matriarch while actively ambushing me with an emergency medical proxy. You tried to publicly humiliate me into signing away my basic human rights. You watched me drink what you thought was a poisoned glass of orange juice this morning, and you smiled. You are not the loving mother of my children. You are a highly toxic, dangerous predator, and I have completely, permanently removed your fangs." Mitchell Reed stepped completely around the glass coffee table, holding a single thin beige folder. He looked down at my weeping wife with absolute total legal contempt. He casually dropped the beige folder directly onto the floor right in front of her trembling knees. It flipped open, revealing a highly official pre-signed divorce decree already fully validated by a senior family court judge. 40 years ago, when you first married my client, you happily signed a standard prenuptial agreement. Mitchell explained, his voice echoing loudly in the massive room. You signed it incredibly quickly because you firmly believed Harlan was just a completely poor working-class man with absolutely no real assets to protect. You arrogantly thought the legal document was completely useless. Cynthia stared down at the divorce decree, her vision completely blurring with fresh, terrified tears. She finally understood the massive, incredibly deep grave she had eagerly dug for herself. That prenuptial agreement was drafted by my senior law partners. Mitchell continued, delivering the final lethal strike. It was an absolutely ironclad legal shield designed specifically to permanently protect his massive financial shadow trust from any future marital claims. Because you have actively committed highly documented, severe financial fraud against your spouse, the strict infidelity and betrayal clauses have been completely permanently activated. You are legally entitled to absolutely zero alimony. You have no legal claim to this massive estate. You have no rights to his expansive investment portfolios. You are leaving this 40-year marriage with exactly what you brought into it on your very first day. Absolutely nothing. Cynthia let out a massive, guttural cry of absolute pure defeat. She slammed her fists against the expensive rug, realizing that her entire life of manufactured luxury was completely over. She could not manipulate her way out of a legally binding federal decree. She looked around the room at her completely broken family, and finally understood the massive, inescapable reality. She was going to be evicted from the only home she had known for decades, and forced to survive on the streets with a completely bankrupt son and a legally ruined daughter. The ultimate architect of the abuse had finally become the ultimate victim of her own massive, blinding greed. The agonizing sound of my wife sobbing uncontrollably against the expensive Persian rug was suddenly drowned out by a completely different noise. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing from the distant highway, but it rapidly grew louder and far more aggressive. The sharp, piercing sound of multiple police sirens cut violently through the quiet suburban morning. The loud wailing grew deafening as several vehicles tore down my private street and abruptly slammed their brakes right in front of my estate. Bright red and blue emergency lights began flashing aggressively through the large living room windows, casting harsh, rapidly shifting shadows across the terrified faces of my completely broken family. Dominic stopped sobbing and slowly looked up toward the window, his bloodshot eyes wide with pure, absolute animal terror. He knew exactly who was coming for him. Mitchell Reed calmly walked over to the heavy oak front door and pulled it wide open before the officers could even knock. 4 heavily armed uniformed police officers and 2 sharply dressed federal agents stepped directly into the grand foyer. Their heavy black boots thudded loudly against the polished marble floor, bringing the absolute crushing weight of federal law directly into my living room. The lead federal agent, a tall, completely unsmiling man with a thick gray mustache, scanned the room and immediately locked his stern eyes onto my son. Dominic was still kneeling on the floor, completely paralyzed by fear. Dominic Hayes, the lead agent, announced, his deep voice projecting absolute, undeniable authority. You are under arrest for severe grand larceny, federal wire fraud, and the unlawful forgery of federal banking documents. Dominic did not try to run. He did not try to argue or beg for a lawyer. The massive, crushing weight of his catastrophic failure had already completely destroyed his spirit. He simply let his arms fall limply to his sides as 2 large uniformed officers stepped forward, pulled his hands roughly behind his back, and secured the heavy cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The loud, sharp clicking of the metal ratchets echoed violently in the quiet room, finalizing his absolute, total ruin. But Allison was an entirely different story. When the second federal agent stepped toward her holding a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, her initial paralyzing shock instantly violently exploded into pure feral rage. She scrambled backward across the hardwood floor, completely ruining her expensive designer dress, desperately trying to put physical distance between herself and the approaching officers. "Do not touch me!" she screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking in pure hysterical panic. "I am not a criminal. I did not forge any documents. I come from a highly respected, wealthy family. You cannot put those disgusting things on my wrists. I will sue this entire police department." The federal agent did not hesitate for a single second. He lunged forward, grabbed her flailing arm with absolute effortless strength, and forcefully pinned her wrists together behind her back. "Allison Hayes, you are under arrest for active participation in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy and severe money laundering," the agent stated calmly, completely ignoring her wild, unhinged screaming. "You actively received and aggressively spent fraudulently obtained federal funds. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." Allison kicked and thrashed like a completely wild animal, entirely losing her carefully constructed high society facade. She shrieked obscenities at the officers, she screamed at her completely unresponsive husband, and she hurled vicious, toxic insults directly at me. The officers practically had to lift her entirely off the floor to drag her out of the living room. Her expensive designer heels scraped loudly against the hardwood floor as she was forcefully marched toward the front door, her shrill, agonizing screams slowly fading as she was shoved roughly into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The lead federal agent turned his attention to Mitchell Reed, securely verifying the specific property rights and the absolute legal boundaries of the estate. Mitchell handed the agent a certified copy of the ironclad revocable trust, completely confirming that I was the sole absolute owner of the entire property. The agent nodded respectfully and then turned his cold, stern gaze towards Cynthia and Valerie, who were both cowering near the living room sofa, completely terrified that they were about to be arrested next. "You 2 are not currently named in the active federal arrest warrants," the agent stated sharply. "However, this is a strictly private residence and the legal property owner has officially revoked your permission to be here. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your personal coats and completely vacate these premises. If you are still standing on this property in 11 minutes, you will both be immediately arrested and formally charged with criminal trespassing." Cynthia looked at the heavily armed agent, completely stunned. "But I live here," and she stammered, her voice weak and incredibly pathetic. "I am his wife. I have lived in this massive house for 20 years. I do not have anywhere else to go. My bank accounts are completely frozen." "You have 9 minutes left," the agent replied, checking his heavy tactical watch, completely entirely unmoved by her desperate, pathetic tears. Valerie finally realized that no amount of crying or manipulation was going to save them from this absolute nightmare. She grabbed her mother's arm, forcefully pulling Cynthia up from the floor. "We have to leave, Mom," Valerie whispered, her voice trembling violently. "They are going to lock us in a jail cell if we stay. We have to go right now." They had absolutely no money. They had absolutely no credit cards. All their expensive luxury vehicles had already been legally repossessed in the middle of the night. Valerie pulled out her smartphone, desperately opening a luxury rideshare application, but her linked banking profiles were already entirely frozen. The digital application completely rejected her request. Her hands shaking uncontrollably, she was forced to search the internet for a cheap local cash-only taxi service. She gathered whatever loose change and small dollar bills she had hidden in the bottom of her designer purse, praying it was enough to get them to a cheap motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. A heavy dark storm had rapidly gathered outside while the massive confrontation was unfolding. Deep, violent thunder rolled across the sky and a cold, freezing downpour began heavily lashing against the large bay windows. Cynthia and Valerie slowly walked toward the front door absolutely empty-handed. They did not even have time to pack a single suitcase. They walked out of the grand foyer, stepping off the covered porch and directly into the freezing torrential rain. I walked slowly out onto the wide covered porch, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my tailored suit trousers. I stood in the dry, quiet shelter of my home, completely untouched by the raging storm. 2 heavy police cruisers were parked in my driveway, their bright red and blue lights violently illuminating the heavy sheets of falling rain. I watched through the rain-slicked windows of the first cruiser as Dominic sat slumped forward in the back seat, his head resting heavily against the thick security glass, completely defeated. In the second cruiser, Allison was still aggressively thrashing and screaming, completely restrained behind the heavy steel mesh, completely trapped in the poverty she so deeply, absolutely despised. Cynthia and Valerie stood at the very end of my long driveway, completely exposed to the freezing, violent storm. Cynthia's expensive designer silk dress was entirely ruined instantly, completely plastered to her shivering body by the freezing rain. Her meticulously styled hair was completely flattened, and her makeup ran heavily down her face in thick, dark, miserable streaks. They huddled together in the freezing cold, completely ruined, completely alone, and completely stripped of their massive, toxic arrogance. 10 minutes later, a highly rusted, beat-up yellow taxicab slowly pulled up to the curb. They climbed into the back seat of the cheap vehicle without looking back even once. The 2 police cruisers slowly pulled away from the estate, their bright flashing lights gradually fading into the dark, stormy morning. The rusted yellow taxicab followed closely behind them, carrying away the absolute last remaining remnants of my toxic, abusive family. I stood on the porch, taking a very deep, slow breath of the cold, crisp autumn air. For the very first time in over 10 years, my massive estate was completely, entirely silent. The loud, arrogant demands were gone. The vicious, condescending insults were gone. The constant, heavy, suffocating threat of their massive, toxic greed had been completely, permanently erased from my existence. The loud, abusive voices that had relentlessly plagued my life were finally completely silenced. I was entirely alone, but I was absolutely, entirely free. The heavy oak front door closed with a deep, resonant thud, completely sealing the massive house against the freezing, torrential rain outside. I reached forward and slowly turned the heavy brass deadbolt, locking the mechanism with a sharp, satisfying click. For a long moment, I simply stood in the grand foyer, resting my hand against the cold, solid wood. The chaotic, flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers had completely faded into the stormy distance, taking the screaming, toxic nightmare of my family with them forever. The silence that rushed back into the expansive house was not empty or lonely. It was incredibly heavy, rich, and profoundly peaceful. It was the absolute silence of a battlefield after a total, decisive victory. I turned away from the door and walked slowly back toward the main living room. The muddy footprints left by the federal agents and the scattered blank pages from the completely useless power of attorney folder were the only physical reminders that a massive, violent confrontation had just occurred. I felt an incredible lightness in my chest, a profound sense of physical and mental relief that I had not experienced in over a decade. I walked into the living room where the warm glow of the stone fireplace completely pushed back the dark, gloomy shadows of the rainy morning. Philip Lancaster and Mitchell Reed were waiting for me near the crackling fire. The towering billionaire had already taken the liberty of opening the antique crystal decanter resting on my polished mahogany side table. He carefully poured 3 generous measures of a highly rare vintage bourbon into heavy crystal glasses. He handed one to Mitchell and then stepped forward, offering the 3rd glass directly to me. We stood together in the warm, quiet light of the fire, 3 men who intimately understood the massive, quiet power of absolute leverage. Lancaster raised his glass, the amber liquid catching the bright, flickering firelight. To Elias Hayes, Lancaster said, his deep voice filled with profound, genuine respect. A true visionary who understood that real wealth is measured in absolute patience and real power is completely invisible. Mitchell and I raised our glasses in silent agreement. To Elias, I echoed softly. The bourbon burned smoothly down my throat, a warm, rich contrast to the freezing betrayal I had just completely eradicated from my life. We sat down in the heavy leather armchairs, the violent storm outside providing a steady, rhythmic background noise against the large bay windows. I looked at the two men who had helped me execute the absolute perfect destruction of my toxic bloodline. I did not use a single ounce of physical violence to defeat them. I reflected aloud, my voice calm and perfectly steady. I did not need to scream obscenities, throw expensive jewelry across the room, or threaten anyone with physical harm. I simply used the cold, unforgiving weight of the federal law and the absolute blinding power of their own massive greed against them. They built their own incredibly elaborate traps. They sharpened their own heavy blades, and they completely, willingly walked right into their own absolute ruin. Cynthia let her blinding arrogance convince her that she could drug me and steal my estate. Dominic let his desperate need to look like a successful tech executive drive him to commit severe federal forgery. Allison let her toxic entitlement blind her to the massive legal consequences of spending stolen money. And Valerie let her shallow vanity destroy her only legitimate business. They were the absolute perfect architects of their own total financial and social annihilation. Mitchell nodded slowly, opening his sleek black leather briefcase one final time. The federal criminal justice system will completely dismantle whatever is left of Dominic, and Allison Mitchell stated with cold professional certainty. They are facing a minimum of 10 years in a federal penitentiary for the wire fraud and money laundering charges. Cynthia and Valerie have absolutely no access to credit, no liquid cash, and no legal standing to ever challenge your estate planning. They are completely permanently neutralized. But we have a much larger, more constructive task to complete today, Harlan. Mitchell pulled out a thick, bound portfolio and placed it gently onto the glass coffee table. This was not a contract designed to destroy anyone. It was a completely foundational charter designed to aggressively build and protect. You instructed me to completely liquidate your daughter's cosmetic brand, Mitchell continued. The $2.4 million has already been successfully secured and cleared through the holding accounts. Combined with the initial massive capital injection from your private shadow trust, we are officially ready to launch the Elias Hayes Foundation. I looked down at the pristine legal charter. This was my ultimate legacy. I had spent the last several weeks experiencing exactly how incredibly vulnerable older generations were to the vicious financial predatory tactics of their own greedy relatives. My family had tried to drug me, steal my hard-earned retirement, and lock me away in a sterile psychiatric ward just to fund their fake luxury lifestyles. The new foundation was specifically designed to be an absolute impenetrable fortress for elder legal protection. We will hire the most aggressive, highly trained corporate and family attorneys in the country, I explained to Lancaster, who was listening with deep, intense interest. We will actively hunt down financial abusers. We will completely audit suspicious medical proxy requests, and we will aggressively prosecute any family member who tries to illegally strip an elderly person of their dignity and their assets. We will provide absolute top-tier legal representation entirely for free to any senior citizen facing the exact same horrific betrayal I just survived. No one will ever be forced to sit in silence while their greedy children steal their entire life. Lancaster smiled a sharp, approving smile, completely recognizing the massive, incredible scale of the operation. You are turning your own personal betrayal into a massive protective shield for thousands of vulnerable people, Lancaster noted with deep admiration. You completely dismantled a criminal conspiracy, and now you are weaponizing your massive wealth to ensure it never happens to anyone else. Your father would be incredibly proud of the man you have become, Harlan. You have honored the founder's token perfectly. Shortly after finalizing the foundation charter documents, Lancaster and Mitchell shook my hand with absolute deep respect and quietly let themselves out. They walked to their waiting black vehicles, leaving me completely alone in the massive, sprawling estate. I did not feel a single trace of regret or sorrow. I walked over to the large bay window and watched their luxury cars disappear down the long private driveway. The heavy torrential rain was finally beginning to slow down, breaking apart to reveal thin, bright rays of pale morning sunlight piercing through the dark gray clouds. The storm was officially over. I walked back to my favorite leather armchair, right next to the crackling stone fireplace, and sat down heavily, letting the profound, deep warmth wash completely over me. The massive house was entirely mine. My vast hidden wealth was completely secure. My future was entirely my own to dictate. I slowly raised my left hand and looked down at the heavy, unpolished titanium watch resting against my skin. The exact same completely plain, unmarked mechanical watch that my incredibly arrogant wife had viciously mocked in front of her wealthy friends just a few short days ago. I watched the sweeping second hand move in a perfect, unbroken, continuous circle. The ticking was incredibly steady, perfectly rhythmic, and absolutely peaceful. It was the exact sound of absolute total victory. My toxic family had completely destroyed themselves in their desperate, frantic rush to steal my kingdom. Now they were completely gone, locked away in federal holding cells and shivering in cheap, rundown motels, entirely erased from my peaceful world. Order had been perfectly and permanently restored to my life. I leaned my head back against the soft, expensive leather, closing my eyes and breathing in the clean, quiet air of my absolute, total freedom. The ultimate, completely satisfying payoff had finally been achieved. I also learned that true strength does not require shouting or desperate acts of physical violence. It resides in quiet patience and the unbreakable boundaries you set to protect your own peace. We often confuse familial loyalty with enduring endless abuse, but true love should never cost you your dignity. I completely stopped funding my own destruction and finally reclaimed my absolute worth. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your sanity, please share your personal story in the comment section below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe for more lessons.